She was just a servant hiding her pain. He was an Alpha King who noticed everything. The bruises on her wrist told a story that would either save his kingdom or destroy everything he'd sworn to protect. But first, he had to decide if one servant's secret was worth risking his throne, and what happened next will shock everyone. Chapter 1. The Weight of Command. Dawn broke over Ravencrest Keep with the pale reluctance of winter mornings, casting long shadows across the stone battlements that Alpha Kael Ravencrest had walked since childhood. From his window, he surveyed the mist-shrouded valleys that stretched beyond his domain, territories he had inherited at 17 when plague claimed his father, leaving him to shoulder burdens that had aged him beyond his 32 years. The oak desk before him groaned beneath stacks of correspondence that would have overwhelmed lesser lords: grain reports from the Eastern Holdings, tax assessments from merchant guilds, military dispatches from border patrols. Each document demanded decisions that affected thousands of lives. Kael approached each with the methodical precision that had kept his duchy prosperous, while neighboring lands succumbed to war and famine. His steward, Aldrich, had often remarked that the Alpha possessed an uncanny ability to read between written lines, detecting deception in formal language and identifying threats before they materialized. This morning proved no different as Kael scrutinized a suspicious request for additional troops from Lord Harwick, whose previous messages had contained subtle inconsistencies that suggested potential rebellion brewing in the southern provinces. Trust no one completely, question everything, and maintain emotional distance from all decisions, his father had counseled during those final plague-ravaged weeks. An Alpha who allows personal feelings to cloud judgment endangers everyone who depends upon his wisdom. The philosophy had served Kael well through 15 years of rule, transforming him from an inexperienced youth into a leader whose reputation for calculated intelligence extended throughout the realm. Yet this morning, as he prepared for another day of administrative duties, he felt the familiar weight of isolation that accompanied absolute authority. The knowledge that his position demanded sacrificing personal desires for the greater good of his people. A soft knock interrupted his contemplation. "Enter," he commanded, without looking up from documents that detailed crop yields requiring careful redistribution to prevent starvation in the northern villages during the approaching harsh season. "Your morning wine, Your Grace?" The voice was barely above a whisper, so quiet that he almost missed the words entirely. Kael glanced up to see Rosalind, the servant girl who had joined his household 6 months earlier. She moved with practiced economy, each step carefully placed to avoid drawing attention to herself. Her auburn hair was braided with the severe efficiency that marked all castle staff, and her brown eyes remained fixed on the wine chalice she carried with both hands. In the months since her arrival, he had noticed her diligence but never truly observed her as an individual. She performed her duties without complaint, never asked for special consideration, and seemed to blend into the castle's daily routines like morning mist dissipating in sunlight. Yet something about her this morning struck him as different, a tension in her movements that his trained observation couldn't ignore. "Good morning, Rosalind," he replied, setting down his quill to study her approach more carefully. She set the chalice on his desk with the same practiced care she always displayed, but as she withdrew her hands, her sleeve caught momentarily on the silver rim. The fabric pulled back just enough to reveal what she had been concealing: dark bruises wrapped around her wrist like twisted rope, some fresh and angry, others fading to sickly yellow. The sight struck him with unexpected force. In all his years of rule, Kael had witnessed the aftermath of battles, negotiated with enemies who would gladly see him dead, and made decisions that cost lives for the greater good. Yet the evidence of deliberate cruelty inflicted upon someone under his protection triggered a response that transcended political calculation, a cold fury that settled in his chest like winter ice. Rosalind noticed his gaze and quickly yanked her sleeve down, her face flushing with embarrassment and what he now recognized as fear, not the respectful wariness that servants typically showed their lords, but genuine terror of discovery and its potential consequences. "I should return to the kitchens, Your Grace," she stammered, already backing toward the door with movements that confirmed his growing suspicions about her circumstances. "Rosalind." His voice carried the quiet authority that made seasoned knights pause mid-sentence. "Remain." She froze like a deer sensing wolves nearby, her entire body radiating the desperate desire to flee, while recognizing the impossibility of disobeying a direct command from her lord. At that moment, Kael understood that whatever had caused those bruises represented more than simple accident or clumsiness. Someone had deliberately harmed a member of his household, violating the most fundamental principle of feudal protection. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing toward the wooden chair positioned across from his desk. "Your Grace, truly, I must—" "Sit." The single word carried 15 years of absolute authority, refined through countless negotiations where lives depended upon his ability to project confidence and control. Rosalind perched on the chair's edge like a sparrow prepared for immediate flight, her hands twisted together in her lap, while her eyes remained fixed on the floor stones worn smooth by generations of Ravencrest Alphas who had conducted business in this same chamber. As Kael studied her carefully controlled posture and the way she seemed to make herself as small as possible, he realized that his morning had taken an unexpected turn. The administrative duties that typically consumed his attention faded into background concerns as a new priority emerged. Discovering who dared harm someone under his protection and ensuring they faced appropriate consequences. The documents on his desk would wait. Justice, however, would not. Chapter 2. Beneath the surface. The silence stretched between them like a bowstring drawn taut, ready to snap at the slightest pressure. Kael had interrogated enough prisoners to recognize when someone was constructing lies, and Rosalind's carefully neutral expression told him that whatever explanation she offered would be crafted to deflect, rather than illuminate. "What happened to your wrist?" he asked, keeping his tone gentle despite the cold calculation building in his mind. "Nothing of consequence, Your Grace. I am naturally clumsy and struck it against the stone wall while carrying water from the well." The words came out in a practiced rush, as if she had rehearsed this explanation multiple times. Kael leaned back in his chair, studying her with the same methodical attention he applied to diplomatic negotiations, where every gesture and word choice revealed hidden meanings. Rosalind's story contained several inconsistencies that his trained mind immediately catalogued. The precise nature of the bruising suggested fingers rather than impact with stone. The symmetrical pattern indicated deliberate grip rather than accidental contact, and her nervous energy spoke of fear rather than embarrassment about clumsiness. "Both wrists?" he inquired softly, noting how she unconsciously rubbed her other arm through the fabric of her sleeve. Her face went pale, confirming his suspicion that the damage extended beyond what he had accidentally witnessed. "Yes, Your Grace. As I said, I am very clumsy." "Show me." "Your Grace, really there is no need." "Show me." His voice remained soft but carried the unmistakable weight of authority that had never been successfully challenged within his domain. Rosalind's hands trembled as she slowly pulled back both sleeves, revealing matching sets of finger-shaped bruises that painted a clear picture of someone grabbing her with violent intent. The marks were too precise and too recent to support any explanation involving accidents or clumsiness. Something shifted in Kael's chest, a protective instinct he hadn't experienced since his younger sister's death from fever 10 years earlier. The sensation caught him off guard, as did the intensity of anger building behind his carefully maintained facade of local composure. He had dedicated his adult life to maintaining emotional distance from personal attachments that might compromise his judgment, yet seeing evidence of deliberate cruelty towards someone he was duty-bound to protect triggered responses that transcended political calculation. "Who did this to you?" The question emerged with deceptive calm that masked the storm gathering in his thoughts. "No one, Your Grace. I told you—" "Rosalind." He leaned forward, capturing her frightened gaze with his own. "You serve in my household, under my roof, eating bread purchased with my coin. That makes you my responsibility, and I take my responsibilities seriously. Do you understand what that means?" For a moment, hope flickered in her brown eyes like candle flame fighting against wind. Her lips parted as if she might finally speak truth instead of carefully constructed lies. Then fear reasserted itself, and she stood abruptly. "I truly should return to my duties, Your Grace. The cook will wonder at my absence." Kael watched her flee from his presence with movements that confirmed every suspicion he had developed during their brief conversation. Someone was systematically terrorizing a member of his household, and that someone possessed enough influence or intimidation to ensure her silence even when offered his personal protection. The realization troubled him on multiple levels. His reputation for protecting those under his authority was integral to maintaining loyalty and stability throughout his domain. If word spread that he couldn't safeguard his own servants, it would encourage challenges from ambitious lords who might interpret such weakness as opportunity for territorial expansion or political manipulation. More disturbing was his personal reaction to Rosalind's plight. The protective anger he felt transcended simple feudal obligation to encompass something dangerously close to emotional investment. Such feelings represented exactly the kind of personal attachment his father had warned against, the trap that could compromise a ruler's objectivity and lead to decisions based on sentiment rather than strategic wisdom. Yet as he returned to his correspondence, Kael found concentration impossible. The image of those deliberate bruises haunted his thoughts, along with the terrified way Rosalind had fled rather than accept his offer of protection. Someone in his domain was using violence to control a defenseless young woman, and they felt confident enough in their position to continue such behavior despite her employment in the Alpha's household. By midday, his patience with administrative duties had evaporated entirely. Kael summoned his captain of guards, Sir Marcus Thorne, a grizzled veteran whose loyalty had been tested in battles that had claimed lesser men. If anyone could uncover the truth behind Rosalind's injuries, it would be Marcus. "I need information," Kael stated without preamble when the captain arrived. "Rosalind, the servant girl who brings my morning wine, someone has been harming her, and I want to know who possesses the audacity to abuse a member of my household." Marcus's weathered features darkened with the expression that had intimidated enemies across 3 duchies. "I'll discover the truth, Your Grace. And when I do?" "When you do, we'll discuss appropriate responses. But Marcus, discretion is essential. If this involves someone with political connections, I need to understand the full scope of the situation before taking action." As his captain departed to begin the investigation, Kael acknowledged that his day had taken an irrevocable turn. The administrative duties that normally consumed his attention now seemed trivial, compared to the mystery of who dared harm someone under his protection and why they felt confident enough to continue such behavior. The Alpha King of Ravencrest had built his reputation on methodical intelligence and calculated responses to threats. Now those skills would be applied to a problem that touched something deeper than political obligation, a growing determination to protect someone who had begun to matter to him in ways that challenged everything he believed about maintaining emotional distance from personal attachments. The investigation would begin immediately, and when it concluded, justice would follow with the same inevitable certainty that characterized all of his decisions. Some lines simply could not be crossed without consequences, regardless of who felt entitled to cross them. Chapter 3. Shadows and Whispers. Evening brought Marcus back to Kael's with intelligence that transformed suspicion into cold certainty. The captain's expression carried the grim satisfaction of a hunter who had tracked dangerous prey to its lair, confirming what Kael had feared. This situation extended far beyond simple domestic violence into the realm of political intimidation and abuse of noble privilege. "Sir Gareth Voss," Marcus reported without preamble, his scarred hands clasped behind his back in military posture. "Son of minor nobility from the Eastern Marches, nephew to Lord Commander Willem Voss of the Royal Guard. He and the girl were betrothed before she came to serve in your household." Kael's jaw tightened as implications became clear. Willem Voss commanded significant influence at the royal court, his position granting him access to the king's ear and considerable power to protect family members from consequences that would destroy ordinary knights. Gareth's abuse of Rosalind wasn't random violence. It was calculated intimidation backed by political connections that made him effectively untouchable through conventional justice. The betrothal was broken when her father couldn't provide the agreed dowry, Marcus continued, but Voss refuses to accept the dissolution. He's been cornering her in the village, claiming she belongs to him by prior contract regardless of changed circumstances. And the local magistrate? Kael inquired, though he suspected the answer would confirm his worst fears about corruption and intimidation. Refuses to intervene. Voss's connections to the royal court make him untouchable through normal legal channels. He's been boasting in taverns about reclaiming what was stolen and making inquiries about Ravencrest Keep's defenses, claiming he might need to retrieve misappropriated property. The casual audacity struck Kael like a physical blow. Not content with terrorizing Rosalind through private violence, Gareth was now treating her as stolen goods, while simultaneously gathering intelligence about local defenses, behavior that bordered on treason yet remained protected by his uncle's influence at court. "There's more, Your Grace." Marcus's tone carried a warning that worse revelations were forthcoming. "My contacts in the capital report that Gareth has been accepting bribes from merchants seeking favorable trade arrangements, using his knightly status to extort protection payments from traveling caravans. His uncle's position shields him from investigation." Kael absorbed this information with the calculating detachment that had served him through 15 years of political maneuvering. Gareth Voss represented more than a simple threat to one servant. He embodied systematic corruption that used noble privilege to exploit the vulnerable, while undermining legitimate authority through intimidation and political manipulation. "He's been asking about your daily routines," Marcus added grimly. "Wants to know when you're away from the keep, how many guards accompany you during travels, which entrances offer easiest access to the servant quarters." The intelligence transformed Kael's anger into something far more dangerous. Strategic fury backed by local authority and 15 years of experience dealing with threats to his domain. Gareth's behavior had escalated beyond harassment into preparation for direct action that could threaten Rosalind's safety and challenge Kael's authority simultaneously. "Double the guards on all entrances," Kael commanded. "Establish rotating patrols through the servant quarters. I want armed men positioned where they can respond immediately to any unauthorized intrusion. Already done, Your Grace, but if Voss decides to act through official channels, claiming theft of property or demanding satisfaction for perceived injuries, his uncle's influence could create complications at court." Kael understood the warning. Direct confrontation with Gareth would likely trigger political retaliation through royal authority, potentially forcing the king to choose between supporting an Alpha's protection of his household and maintaining relationships with the Lord Commander whose loyalty was essential for court security. Such calculations had shaped every significant decision of his adult life. The prudent course would be arranging Rosalind's transfer to another household, removing her from Gareth's reach while avoiding political confrontation that could damage relationships essential for his duchy's security and prosperity. Yet, as he considered this practical solution, Kael found himself remembering the terror in her eyes and the desperate way she had tried to conceal evidence of abuse. The protective instinct that had surprised him that morning now demanded action regardless of political consequences. A response that challenged everything he believed about maintaining emotional distance from personal attachments. "Your Grace?" Marcus prompted, recognizing the internal struggle reflected in his lord's expression. "Continue gathering intelligence," Kael decided. "I want comprehensive information about Gareth's activities, his debts, his associates, and any vulnerability that might provide leverage. If he wants to play political games, he'll discover that I've been practicing longer than he's been alive." As Marcus departed to continue his investigation, Kael acknowledged that his response to this situation was revealing aspects of his character that contradicted his carefully cultivated reputation for dispassionate judgment. The smart political move would be arranging Rosalind's departure to avoid confrontation with powerful enemies. Instead, he found himself planning strategies for protecting her while simultaneously destroying someone whose political connections should make him untouchable. The Alpha of Ravencrest was preparing for war. Not the kind fought with armies on battlefields, but the more dangerous variety conducted through reputation, influence, and careful manipulation of information that could destroy enemies without leaving obvious evidence. Gareth Voss had made the mistake of threatening someone under local protection. Soon he would learn that political connections meant nothing when facing someone who understood how to use power with surgical precision, targeting vulnerabilities that even the Lord Commander's influence couldn't protect. The game was beginning, and Kael intended to win decisively. Chapter 4. The Price of Silence. 3 days of careful observation confirmed Kael's growing conviction that Rosalind's situation was deteriorating rapidly, despite increased security around the keep. She moved through her duties with the brittle efficiency of someone functioning on nervous energy alone, her eyes constantly scanning for threats while her hands trembled whenever she believed herself unobserved. During his morning routine in the training yard, Kael positioned himself where he could watch the servants' entrance while sparring with Sir Aldwin, his master-at-arms. The physical exertion helped channel his mounting frustration into productive activity, yet his attention remained divided between combat techniques and surveillance of potential threats to someone whose welfare had become increasingly important to his peace of mind. "Your Grace seems distracted," Aldwin observed as they concluded their session, both men breathing heavily from the intense workout that had served as an outlet for Kael's suppressed anger about circumstances he couldn't immediately control through direct action. "Administrative concerns," Kael replied dismissively, unwilling to reveal how deeply Rosalind's plight had affected his emotional equilibrium, or acknowledge that his carefully maintained detachment was crumbling in the face of someone's genuine need for protection that transcended political obligation. The truth was more complicated than simple distraction. Since discovering the evidence of abuse, Kael found himself thinking about Rosalind at unexpected moments, wondering about her background, questioning why she had remained silent about Gareth's harassment, and experiencing protective instincts that challenged his fundamental beliefs about maintaining emotional distance from personal attachments that could compromise objective judgment. That afternoon brought disturbing news from Marcus's ongoing investigation. The captain entered Kael's chamber with the expression of someone who had uncovered information that would complicate an already difficult situation. "Gareth visited the village yesterday," Marcus reported grimly. "Cornered the girl outside the baker's shop, demanded she return to his custody voluntarily or face consequences for stolen goods claims he intends to file with royal magistrates." Kael's grip tightened on the quill he had been using to review tax assessments that now seemed insignificant compared to more immediate threats to someone whose safety had become his personal responsibility. Witnesses? Several, but they're too frightened to speak openly. Voss made certain his conversation was overheard, wanting word to spread about his intentions. He's escalating pressure while maintaining appearance of legal justification for his actions. The calculated nature of Gareth's intimidation revealed sophisticated understanding of how to use political connections and legal technicalities to achieve objectives that direct violence might not accomplish as effectively. By claiming legal grievances related to broken contracts and stolen property, he could force Rosalind to choose between voluntary submission and official prosecution that would destroy her reputation, while potentially implicating Kael as harborer of stolen goods. "He left a message," Marcus continued reluctantly. "Said to tell you that misunderstandings between nobles could be resolved through appropriate compensation, if you prefer avoiding unpleasant legal proceedings that might damage your reputation at court." The barely concealed threat struck Kael as particularly audacious. Gareth was essentially demanding ransom for not pursuing fabricated legal claims, while simultaneously threatening political retaliation if his demands weren't met. Such behavior demonstrated either remarkable confidence in his uncle's protection or dangerous underestimation of local authority. "He's giving you until tomorrow to respond," Marcus added. "After that, he files formal complaints with royal authorities claiming theft of contracted property and demanding immediate restitution." Kael absorbed this ultimatum with the calculating calm that had carried him through previous crises where wrong decisions could trigger disasters affecting thousands of lives. Every instinct demanded immediate action to crush this threat before it could metastasize into larger problems. Yet political reality required more subtle approaches that wouldn't trigger retaliation from court authorities, whose support was essential for his duchy's security. The prudent response would be negotiating some face-saving compromise that satisfied Gareth's demands while protecting Rosalind through relocation to another household. Such pragmatic solutions had preserved peace throughout his domain, maintaining stability through careful balance of competing interests rather than principled stands that could trigger wider conflicts. Yet as he considered this practical approach, Kael found himself remembering the desperate fear in Rosalind's eyes and the systematic nature of abuse that would continue regardless of which household employed her. Compromise with Gareth would abandon her to ongoing victimization while setting precedent that local protection could be circumvented through sufficient political pressure and legal intimidation. "Double her security detail," he decided. "I want armed guards positioned to intervene immediately if Gareth attempts direct action. And Marcus, begin investigating Gareth's financial situation, his personal habits, his associates. If he wants to threaten me through legal manipulation, he'll discover that I know how to gather evidence for countercharges that his uncle's influence cannot protect him from. Your Grace, if this escalates to open conflict with the Lord Commander's family, then it escalates," Kael interrupted with quiet finality. "Some principles cannot be compromised without losing everything that makes authority legitimate. If protecting those under my care triggers political consequences, I'll face them with a clear conscience rather than surrender someone to systematic abuse for the sake of convenient peace." The decision marked a turning point in more than just his conflict with Gareth Voss. By choosing protection over pragmatism, Kael was acknowledging that Rosalind had become important enough to risk his carefully cultivated relationships with royal authorities. A recognition that challenged his fundamental beliefs about maintaining emotional distance from personal attachments. Tomorrow would bring Gareth's deadline. Tonight would be spent preparing responses that honored both strategic wisdom and moral obligation, regardless of the political storm that might follow. The Alpha of Ravencrest was discovering that some battles were worth fighting, even when victory carried costs he couldn't yet calculate. Chapter 5. Lines drawn in stone dawn brought with it the weight of decision that would reshape Kael's understanding of his own character. As he stood at his chamber window, watching the sun burn away morning mists that clung to the valleys below, he reflected on how a simple moment of observation had led to circumstances that challenged everything he believed about balancing personal desires against local responsibilities. The night had brought little sleep, his mind cycling through scenarios that ranged from diplomatic solutions to outright warfare, each option carrying consequences that could affect thousands of lives depending on how political authorities responded to challenges against noble privilege and court influence. Yet beneath these strategic calculations lay something more fundamental, a growing recognition that some principles mattered more than political convenience. A soft knock interrupted his contemplation. "Enter," he called, already knowing that Rosalind would arrive with his morning wine, her presence serving as a reminder of why this decision had become unavoidable despite its potential costs. She entered with the same careful movements he had observed for months, yet now he noticed details that revealed the strain of living under constant threat. Dark circles beneath her eyes spoke of sleepless nights, while the way she held herself suggested someone preparing for anticipated violence that could arrive without warning. "Good morning, Your Grace," she whispered, approaching his desk with the chalice held in both hands to prevent any trembling from revealing her fear. "Rosalind," he said gently, setting aside correspondence that had occupied his attention, but failed to distract from more pressing concerns. "We need to discuss your situation." She froze mid-step, her face going pale as she recognized that her circumstances had moved beyond private shame into official local attention. "Your Grace, I don't understand." "Yes, you do." His tone carried quiet certainty rather than accusation. "Gareth Voss has issued an ultimatum demanding your return to his custody. He threatens legal action if I refuse to surrender someone under my protection to systematic abuse that dishonors everything my authority represents." The chalice nearly slipped from her trembling hands before she managed to set it on his desk, without spilling wine that would stain documents requiring his attention throughout the morning. "Your Grace, please don't involve yourself in my troubles. Sir Gareth has powerful connections that could bring harm to your reputation." Her concern for his welfare, despite her own desperate circumstances, struck Kael with unexpected force. Here was someone more worried about protecting him from political consequences than securing her own safety. A selflessness that challenged his assumptions about servant loyalty, while reinforcing his determination to shield her from ongoing victimization. "My reputation will survive whatever political storms result from protecting those under my care," he replied with conviction that surprised him. "The question is whether you're willing to accept that protection, knowing it may require testimony about abuse you've suffered and witnessed." Rosalind stared at him with an expression that combined hope with terror, as if she couldn't quite believe that someone with power would risk using it on her behalf. "He'll destroy me, Your Grace. His uncle commands the royal guard. They can fabricate evidence, manipulate witnesses, turn legal proceedings into persecution that will leave me with nothing." "Only if they're allowed to control the narrative," Kael countered. "But what if we gather evidence first? What if we expose corruption and criminal behavior that even the Lord Commander cannot protect through political influence?" The possibility that victims might become prosecutors rather than remaining perpetual prey had clearly never occurred to her. Years of systematic intimidation had taught Rosalind to accept abuse as inevitable rather than seeking justice that might actually be achievable through careful planning and strategic action. "I need to know everything," Kael continued. "Every threat, every incident, every witness who might testify about Gareth's criminal behavior. If we're going to war against corrupt privilege, we'll do it with overwhelming evidence that destroys his credibility while protecting innocent people from retaliation." For the first time since he had known her, Rosalind met his gaze directly. Something in her expression shifted from resignation to tentative determination, as if his confidence in achieving justice had begun to rekindle hope she had thought permanently extinguished. "He has gambling debts," she said quietly. "Substantial ones that he's been paying through extortion from merchants and travelers. The innkeeper's wife mentioned bribes he's taken for favorable testimony in legal disputes." Kael felt satisfaction that had nothing to do with political calculation and everything to do with seeing someone begin to fight back against circumstances that had seemed hopeless. "Good. What else?" "There are other women," she admitted with difficulty. "Servants, merchant daughters, anyone he believes cannot seek protection through normal channels. He uses his position to demand favors in exchange for not pursuing fabricated charges." The systematic nature of Gareth's criminal enterprise revealed someone who had been operating with impunity for years, protected by his uncle's influence while victimizing anyone too powerless to seek justice through official channels. Such behavior represented exactly the kind of corruption that undermined legitimate authority, while making mockery of noble obligations to protect the vulnerable. "We'll expose everything," Kael promised with quiet finality. "By the time this investigation concludes, Gareth Voss will face justice for crimes that his uncle's position cannot shield him from. But I need your commitment to see this through regardless of intimidation or threats that will inevitably come." Rosalind straightened with visible effort, her expression revealing someone choosing courage despite years of learned helplessness that had taught her to expect betrayal rather than protection from those with power to make difference in her circumstances. "I'll testify," she said with a voice that grew stronger as she spoke. "If you truly believe justice is possible, I'll tell the truth about everything he's done." The moment marked a transformation for both of them. She was choosing to trust despite experience that taught caution, while he was committing to battle that would test every skill he possessed as strategist and leader, determined to achieve victory against seemingly impossible odds. "Then we begin today," Kael declared. "Marcus will coordinate gathering evidence while I reach out to other nobles who've suffered under Gareth's corruption. If he wants to threaten me through political manipulation, he'll discover that I know how to fight such battles more effectively than he imagines possible." As Rosalind departed with something approaching confidence rather than her usual fearful urgency, Kael acknowledged that he had crossed a line that would reshape his understanding of what it meant to be a leader worthy of the loyalty others placed in his judgment and protection. The war for justice had begun, and he intended to win it decisively. Chapter 6. Gathering Storms. The war room beneath Ravencrest Keep had witnessed strategy sessions for conflicts spanning 3 generations of Alphas, its stone walls bearing witness to decisions that had shaped the political landscape throughout the Northern Territories. Now it hosted a different kind of battle planning as Kael coordinated intelligence-gathering operations designed to expose corruption that extended far beyond Gareth Voss into networks of privilege and influence that had operated with impunity for years. Marcus spread documents across the massive oak table that dominated the chamber, each piece of evidence representing another thread in the web of criminal behavior they were methodically unraveling. Financial records, witness statements, correspondence intercepted through careful surveillance, all painted a picture of systematic exploitation that made Gareth's abuse of Rosalind merely one crime among many that demanded justice. "The gambling debts are substantial," Marcus reported with grim satisfaction. "He owes gold to merchant houses in 3 different cities, moneylenders who've grown impatient with delayed payments. More importantly, we have testimony from witnesses who can prove he's been using royal authority to extort payments that fund his gambling addiction." Kael studied the financial documentation with the analytical precision that had made him one of the most effective administrators in the realm. The numbers told a story of progressive desperation masked by apparent wealth. Gareth had been living far beyond his means, using his position to generate illegal income that supported a lifestyle he couldn't afford through legitimate sources. "These merchants he's been extorting," Kael mused. "Will they testify if they are guaranteed protection from retaliation?" "Already secured their cooperation," Marcus confirmed. "They're tired of paying bribes to conduct honest business. Lord Blackwood has agreed to provide sanctuary for any witnesses who fear retribution, while Lord Hartwell is documenting similar extortion attempts in his territory." The growing coalition of nobles willing to challenge Gareth's corruption represented strategic victory in itself. By framing this conflict as a righteous crusade against systematic abuse rather than personal dispute between individual lords, Kael was building political cover that would make it difficult for the Lord Commander to protect his nephew without appearing to endorse criminal behavior that threatened legitimate commerce and noble authority. "What about the Royal Treasury investigation?" Kael inquired, referring to the most damaging discovery Marcus had uncovered during his careful research into Gareth's financial activities. "Confirmed," Marcus replied with an expression that suggested particular satisfaction with this revelation. "He's been skimming gold intended for border fortifications, falsifying reports to cover shortfalls while using stolen funds to pay gambling debts. We have documentation proving theft from royal coffers, a crime that even his uncle cannot protect him from without appearing treasonous himself." The evidence of theft from royal resources transformed their conflict from local dispute into a matter of national security that would force court authorities to choose between justice and corruption. No political influence could shield someone who had stolen from the crown, regardless of family connections or previous services that might have earned protection under different circumstances. "The timeline for presentation to royal authorities?" Kael asked, recognizing that coordination would be essential for achieving maximum impact while preventing Gareth from destroying evidence or eliminating witnesses who could testify about his criminal enterprise. Lord Fairfax has arranged an audience with the king for next week, Marcus reported. As Lord High Steward, his word carries weight equal to the Lord Commander's influence. When he presents evidence of systematic theft and corruption, it will be impossible to dismiss as political maneuvering or personal vendetta. Kael nodded approvingly at the strategic sophistication of their approach. By working through multiple respected lords who had suffered under Gareth's extortion, while presenting evidence to royal authorities through channels that commanded respect, they were making it politically impossible for anyone to defend criminal behavior without appearing complicit in corruption that threatened the foundation of lawful governance. Rosalind's testimony will be crucial, he observed, understanding that personal accounts of abuse would humanize what might otherwise appear as abstract financial crimes requiring complex analysis to understand their significance for ordinary subjects, who relied upon noble protection from exactly this kind of exploitation. She's been meeting with the other victims, Marcus reported, helping them understand that testimony given in coordination with multiple witnesses provides protection through numbers that individual accusations might lack. They're finding courage through solidarity that none possessed when facing intimidation alone. The transformation of isolated victims into organized witnesses represented political development that would make their case virtually impossible to dismiss through character assassination or intimidation tactics that had previously kept Gareth's crimes hidden from official scrutiny. Multiple corroborating testimonies from diverse sources would create overwhelming evidence that even skilled advocates could not effectively challenge. The Lord Commander's response to these developments? Kael inquired, knowing that Willem Voss would not remain passive while evidence mounted against his nephew's criminal behavior. Increasingly desperate attempts to discredit the investigation, Marcus replied grimly. He's been spreading rumors about a political conspiracy designed to damage royal authority through fabricated charges against loyal knights. But his influence is waning as more nobles join the coalition demanding justice for systematic corruption. The political momentum was shifting decisively in their favor as corruption was exposed and victims found courage to speak truth that had been suppressed through intimidation and fear of retaliation. Yet Kael understood that cornered predators often became most dangerous when facing inevitable defeat, making it essential to maintain security while preventing desperate actions that could harm innocent people. Double protection for all witnesses, he commanded. If Gareth realizes his political shields are crumbling, he may attempt to eliminate evidence through violence, rather than face justice through legal proceedings that will expose the full scope of his criminal enterprise. As evening settled over Ravencrest Keep and preparations continued for the confrontation that would determine whether justice could triumph over privileged corruption, Kael reflected on how much his understanding of leadership had evolved since discovering evidence of abuse that challenged his fundamental beliefs about maintaining emotional distance from personal attachments. Protecting Rosalind had become protecting principle itself, the idea that authority existed to shield the vulnerable rather than exploit them, that power carried obligation to serve justice rather than personal advantage. Protecting Rosalind had become protecting principle itself. The idea that authority existed to shield the vulnerable rather than exploit them, that power carried the obligation to serve justice rather than personal advantage, and that some battles were worth fighting regardless of political cost because surrendering them meant surrendering everything that made leadership morally legitimate. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as their investigation moved from evidence gathering into active confrontation with forces that had operated with impunity for years. The stakes extended far beyond one servant's safety to encompass fundamental questions about whether noble privilege could be reformed through lawful means, or whether corruption had become so entrenched that only dramatic action could restore balance between power and responsibility. The Alpha of Ravencrest was prepared for whatever response their challenge would provoke. Yet he knew that victory would require more than strategic thinking. It would demand courage to risk everything he had built for principles that transcended personal advancement or political convenience. The war for justice was escalating, and soon it would test whether righteousness could triumph over systematic corruption when backed by determination that refused to accept defeat as an inevitable outcome of challenging established power structures that benefited from maintaining oppression through fear and intimidation. Chapter 7. The hunter becomes hunted. The attack came at dawn, swift and vicious as a mountain storm breaking over unprepared travelers. Kael was returning from his morning ride through the eastern borders when crossbow bolts began whistling through the forest air, their steel points seeking flesh with accuracy that spoke of professional training, rather than random banditry that might be dismissed as unfortunate coincidence, rather than deliberate assassination attempt. "Ambush!" Sir Aldwyn shouted, wheeling his destrier toward the nearest cover while drawing steel that gleamed with deadly promise in the early morning light. "Protect his grace!" The escort of 6 knights formed defensive circle around Kael with practiced efficiency that had been drilled through countless training sessions, yet their attackers had chosen their ground well. Dense woodland that limited mounted maneuvers while providing concealment for archers whose positions remained hidden among ancient oak trees that had witnessed centuries of violence in these disputed borderlands. 8 crossbowmen, possibly more, Marcus called from his position behind a massive boulder that offered protection from projectiles, while allowing observation of enemy movements through undergrowth that rustled with stealthy repositioning designed to maintain tactical advantage. Professional equipment, coordinated tactics, this is no random assault. Kael's mind raced through possibilities as he analyzed their tactical situation, with the strategic thinking that had kept him alive through previous assassination attempts by ambitious rivals who had underestimated his preparedness for exactly this kind of direct action. The timing suggested coordination with his investigation into Gareth's criminal enterprise. Someone had decided that eliminating key witnesses was preferable to facing justice through legal proceedings that would expose systematic corruption. "Can we break through to open ground?" he asked Marcus, recognizing that their current position left them vulnerable to sustained assault that could gradually eliminate his escort, while leaving him isolated and defenseless against enemies whose numbers remained unknown. "Possible, but costly," Marcus replied grimly. "They've positioned themselves to channel our movement toward prepared killing ground where additional forces may be waiting in reserve." Another volley of bolts forced them deeper into cover, as steel points embedded themselves in tree trunks with impacts that demonstrated the power behind weapons designed for killing armored opponents, rather than simple intimidation or warning shots meant to discourage rather than destroy their intended targets. "Your Grace?" called Sir Aldwyn from his position behind a fallen log that provided temporary shelter. "We need to assume this attack is intended to prevent your testimony about certain criminal activities. If we can capture one alive—" His words were cut short by a crossbow bolt that took him through the shoulder, spinning him around with force that dropped him behind cover, while blood began staining his mail with spreading crimson that spoke of serious injury requiring immediate attention. They couldn't provide while under sustained assault. Rage flared in Kael's chest as he watched one of his most loyal knights fall victim to cowardly attack from concealed positions. These weren't honorable enemies seeking fair combat. They were paid killers using terrain advantage to murder men whose only crime was serving Alpha, who demanded justice for systematic abuse and corruption that threatened innocent people throughout his domain. "Marcus, take 2 men and circle south," he commanded, with a voice that carried absolute authority despite their desperate circumstances. "Force them to divide attention while we push north toward the main road where reinforcements can reach us." "I won't leave you with insufficient protection. That's an order." Kael's tone brooked no argument despite the personal concern that motivated Marcus's reluctance to separate their already outnumbered force. "Those crossbowmen are professionals, but they're not expecting coordinated assault from multiple directions. We use their confidence against them." The plan was desperate and risky, yet it offered their best chance for survival against enemies who had prepared this ambush with careful attention to preventing escape through normal routes that predictable traveling patterns would suggest to anyone conducting surveillance of local movements throughout the territory. As Marcus departed with half their remaining force, Kael found himself thinking not of his own survival, but of Rosalind and the other witnesses, whose safety depended upon his ability to testify about evidence they had gathered concerning Gareth's criminal enterprise. This assassination attempt confirmed their investigation had struck close enough to vital interests to trigger desperate response from enemies who preferred murder to facing justice through legitimate legal proceedings. "Sir Gareth, on my signal we charge the eastern position," he called to his remaining knight, a young man whose courage had been tested in border skirmishes, but never in circumstances where failure meant death, not just for themselves, but for innocent people depending upon their survival to achieve justice against systematic oppression. "Your Grace, the risk of remaining passive exceeds the danger of decisive action," Kael interrupted, drawing his own sword with movements that felt natural despite years spent primarily in administrative duties, rather than active combat that had characterized his youth before inheriting responsibilities that required different skills. The charge broke cover with explosive violence that caught their attackers by surprise, Kael's destrier thundering through undergrowth, while his blade swept aside defensive positions that hadn't anticipated direct assault from opponents who should have remained pinned down by superior numbers and tactical positioning. Steel met steel with ringing impacts that echoed through forest depths as professional killers discovered that their intended victim possessed combat skills to match his reputation for strategic intelligence. Kael's swordwork demonstrated training that had never been abandoned despite administrative duties. Muscle memory guiding strikes that found gaps in armor while his mount's hooves trampled enemies who had expected easy victory against supposedly soft targets. The fight ended with brutal efficiency as Marcus's flanking maneuver struck remaining crossbowmen from unexpected direction, eliminating threats that had seemed insurmountable when faced from prepared positions, but proved vulnerable when attacked by coordinated force that denied them advantage of concealment and surprise. "Two alive for questioning," Marcus reported as he secured prisoners whose equipment and training confirmed Kael's suspicions about professional assassination attempt rather than random banditry that might be dismissed as unfortunate coincidence unrelated to their investigation. As they bound wounds and prepared for return to Ravencrest Keep, with evidence that would prove attempted murder by forces connected to their investigation, Kael understood that the war for justice had escalated beyond legal maneuvering into direct violence that confirmed how much their enemies feared exposure of criminal behavior that extended throughout networks of privilege and corruption. Someone had decided that killing an alpha was preferable to allowing testimony that would reveal systematic abuse and theft from royal coffers. Such desperation suggested they were close to achieving victory that would destroy criminal enterprise and restore balance between power and responsibility that defined legitimate governance. The hunters had become hunted, and their enemies' desperation would provide final evidence needed to achieve justice that no political influence could prevent or corrupt. Chapter 8: Revelations in Blood. The interrogation chamber beneath Ravencrest Keep had extracted confessions from countless enemies over the centuries, its stone walls bearing witness to truth forced from reluctant lips through methods that combined psychological pressure with physical discomfort, designed to overcome resistance without permanent damage that might invalidate testimony required for legal proceedings. Now it hosted 2 professional killers, whose equipment and training confirmed every suspicion about the systematic nature of opposition to Kael's investigation into corruption that extended far beyond Gareth Voss into networks of influence that had operated with impunity for years through intimidation and violence against anyone who dared challenge their criminal enterprise. Hired through intermediaries, the first assassin admitted after hours of careful questioning that had revealed the sophisticated nature of conspiracy against local authority. Gold delivered through merchant contacts, orders given through coded messages that protected those who commissioned our services from direct implication in attempted murder. Kael studied the man with analytical detachment that masked his growing fury at evidence of systematic conspiracy to eliminate witnesses and destroy evidence that would expose crimes reaching into the highest levels of court authority. These weren't random brigands seeking easy plunder. They were soldiers in an undeclared war against justice itself. "The intermediaries," Marcus pressed with a voice that carried the threat of consequences for continued resistance to cooperation, that offered their only chance for mercy in judicial proceedings that would otherwise result in execution for attempted assassination of local authority. A merchant named Corwin Blackthorne operates warehouses near the capital, the prisoner replied reluctantly. He coordinates messages between those who pay and those who kill, ensuring no direct contact that might expose the true sources of funding for activities that officially don't exist. The revelation provided crucial intelligence about infrastructure supporting criminal operations that extended throughout the realm, suggesting coordination between corrupt nobles whose influence reached into royal administration itself. Exposing this network would require evidence that even the most powerful protectors couldn't dismiss as political maneuvering or personal vendetta between individual lords. Written orders? Kael inquired, recognizing that documentary evidence would prove essential for convincing royal authorities that systematic corruption threatened the foundation of lawful governance throughout territories that relied upon noble integrity for maintaining peace and prosperity. Burned after reading, the assassin confirmed. But Blackthorne keeps records of payments received and services rendered. Insurance against betrayal by those who employ his network for activities they cannot acknowledge publicly without destroying their reputations and political positions. Marcus exchanged meaningful glances with Kael as implications became clear. Financial records maintained by criminal intermediaries would provide irrefutable evidence linking corrupt nobles to systematic violence against witnesses and obstruction of justice through murder and intimidation, designed to prevent exposure of crimes that reached into royal administration itself. The location of these records? Marcus demanded with a tone that suggested immediate cooperation would determine whether the prisoner faced quick execution or prolonged interrogation, designed to extract every detail about criminal conspiracy that threatened legitimate governance throughout the Northern Territories. Before the assassin could respond, urgent knocking interrupted their session. Sir Garrett entered with an expression that combined excitement with concern about developments that would affect their investigation's direction and ultimate success in achieving justice through legal means rather than private warfare that might destabilize political relationships essential for maintaining peace. Your Grace, Lord Fairfax has arrived with royal investigators, Garrett reported breathlessly. They're carrying writs of examination for financial records related to systematic theft from Crown resources and corruption of royal authority through abuse of official positions for personal enrichment. The timing struck Kael as remarkably fortunate, or perhaps carefully coordinated through allies who understood that evidence gathering must proceed rapidly before enemies could destroy documentation that proved criminal behavior spanning years of systematic exploitation of royal trust and noble privilege for illegal purposes. The Lord Commander's response, Kael asked, knowing that Willem Voss would not surrender his nephew without desperate attempts to protect family honor and personal position that depended upon maintaining a reputation for loyalty to royal interests above personal advancement or factional politics. Barricaded himself in his estates with armed guards, Garrett replied grimly. Claims illness prevents travel to court for testimony about accusations he describes as fabricated attacks upon royal authority, designed to destabilize legitimate governance through false evidence and coordinated political conspiracy. The defensive posture confirmed that their investigation had achieved a decisive breakthrough. Enemies who had previously operated through intimidation and legal manipulation were now reduced to direct defiance of royal authority through armed resistance that would itself constitute treasonous behavior, requiring immediate military response. Gareth? Marcus inquired, understanding that the primary target of their investigation remained dangerous, as long as he retained freedom to coordinate counterattacks against witnesses whose testimony would destroy his criminal enterprise and political protection through family connections. Fled toward the eastern borders with remaining associates, Garrett reported. But royal investigators have issued warrants for immediate arrest on charges of theft from Crown resources and systematic corruption of royal authority for personal enrichment through extortion and abuse of official position. the collapse of political protection that had previously shielded Gareth from consequences represented complete victory, for their careful gathering of evidence and coordination with other nobles who had suffered under systematic corruption that threatened legitimate commerce and honest governance throughout territories that relied upon noble integrity. "The witnesses?" Kael asked, recognizing that Rosalind and others who had found courage to speak truth about abuse would need continued protection during legal proceedings that would determine whether justice could triumph over privileged corruption through lawful means rather than private warfare. Secured in royal custody with full protection during testimony that will expose systematic criminal behavior spanning years of exploitation. Garrett confirmed. Lord Fairfax has guaranteed their safety and legal immunity in exchange for complete cooperation in investigations that will reform corrupt practices threatening royal authority. As afternoon settled over Ravencrest Keep and news arrived of arrests throughout the criminal network that had operated with impunity for years, Kael reflected on how investigation that began with simple observation of abuse had evolved into comprehensive reform of corrupt systems that had exploited the vulnerable, while undermining legitimate governance through systematic violation of noble obligations. The war for justice was approaching conclusion through legal means that would establish precedents protecting innocent people from future exploitation, while demonstrating that no amount of political influence could shield criminal behavior from consequences when evidence was gathered with sufficient care and presented through proper channels that commanded respect from royal authorities. Yet personal satisfaction came not from political victory, but from knowledge that Rosalind and others who had suffered in silence would finally receive justice through testimony that transformed victims into witnesses, whose courage had exposed corruption threatening the foundation of civilized governance itself. Chapter 9. The Web Unravels. The Great Hall of Ravencrest Keep buzzed with activity as royal investigators established their headquarters for conducting the most comprehensive investigation into noble corruption that the realm had witnessed in generations. Tables groaned beneath stacks of evidence that painted a picture of systematic criminal behavior extending far beyond simple abuse of individual servants into networks of extortion, theft, and political manipulation that threatened the foundation of legitimate governance. Lord Fairfax commanded the operation with methodical precision that reminded Kael of his own administrative approach to complex problems requiring careful analysis and strategic coordination. The Lord High Steward's reputation for incorruptible justice made him an ideal choice for leading an investigation that would determine whether royal authority could reform corrupt practices or whether deeper structural changes would be required to restore balance between power and responsibility. The financial records from Blackthorn's warehouses confirmed systematic theft spanning 3 years. Fairfax reported to the assembled investigators whose diverse expertise ensured comprehensive analysis of evidence that revealed criminal conspiracy reaching into multiple levels of royal administration. Conservative estimates suggest 50,000 gold crowns diverted from legitimate purposes to fund gambling debts, personal enrichment, and continuation of criminal activities. Kael absorbed this information with grim satisfaction that had nothing to do with vindication of his personal judgment and everything to do with mathematical proof that their investigation had exposed crimes whose scope exceeded his most pessimistic estimates about corruption's penetration into systems designed to protect innocent people from exactly this kind of systematic exploitation. "The testimony from victims?" he inquired, understanding that human stories would provide emotional context that transformed abstract financial crimes into personal tragedies that royal authorities could not dismiss as mere administrative irregularities, requiring procedural corrections rather than fundamental reform of corrupt practices. "Overwhelming," Fairfax replied, with expression that suggested even his experienced perspective on noble misconduct had been challenged by evidence of systematic abuse documented through multiple corroborating sources. 23 individuals have provided detailed accounts of extortion, sexual assault, and intimidation, designed to maintain silence about criminal behavior that exploited their vulnerability. The numbers struck Kael with force that transcended political calculation, to encompass moral recognition of suffering that had been hidden through fear and systematic intimidation by enemies who understood how to use privilege as a weapon against those lacking resources for seeking justice through official channels designed to protect the powerful rather than serve the vulnerable. Rosalind entered the hall with quiet dignity that demonstrated a remarkable transformation from terrified victim to confident witness, whose courage had inspired others to speak truth that had been suppressed through years of calculated intimidation. Her presence reminded Kael that this investigation had begun with simple observation of abuse and evolved into comprehensive reform through her willingness to trust in the possibility of justice, despite experience that taught caution. "Your Grace," she said with a voice that carried strength earned through surviving circumstances that would have broken individuals lacking her resilience and determination to maintain hope despite overwhelming evidence that powerful enemies could act with impunity. "Lord Fairfax has requested that I review the final witness statements for accuracy." The formal tone reflected protocols established for protecting witnesses during legal proceedings that would determine the fate of criminals whose conviction required testimony that could withstand challenge from skilled advocates who would attempt to discredit evidence through character assassination and procedural objections designed to create reasonable doubt. "How are the others managing?" Kael asked, understanding that courage required ongoing support rather than simple initial determination to speak truth about systematic abuse that had shaped their understanding of power relationships and justice's availability to those lacking political protection. "Finding strength through solidarity," Rosalind replied with a smile that suggested genuine healing rather than mere temporary relief from immediate threats. "Knowing that our testimony serves a larger purpose helps overcome fear of retaliation that previously kept us silent about criminal behavior." The transformation from isolated victims to organized witnesses represented political development whose significance extended beyond immediate legal proceedings to encompass broader questions about how vulnerable populations could protect themselves from systematic exploitation through coordinated action rather than individual resistance that could be easily overcome through intimidation and violence. "The Lord Commander's situation?" Kael inquired of Fairfax, recognizing that Willem Voss's response to his nephew's exposure would determine whether this investigation concluded through legal resolution or escalated into military conflict that could destabilize political relationships essential for maintaining peace throughout the Northern Territories. "Arraigned on charges of harboring known criminals and obstruction of royal justice through abuse of official position," Fairfax reported with satisfaction that reflected successful completion of investigation that had required delicate balance between thorough evidence gathering and diplomatic preservation of institutional relationships. His armed resistance to lawful arrest warrants constitute additional charges of treason against royal authority. The collapse of political protection that had previously made Gareth untouchable represented decisive victory for methodical investigation and strategic patience over immediate emotional responses that might have triggered premature confrontation before sufficient evidence had been gathered to ensure success through legal means rather than private warfare. "Gareth himself?" Marcus asked from his position coordinating security for witnesses whose continued safety remained essential for successful prosecution of criminal conspiracy that had operated through intimidation and violence against anyone who dared challenge corrupt privilege and abuse of noble obligations. "Captured at the eastern border attempting to flee with stolen crown resources," Fairfax replied grimly. His confession implicates additional associates throughout the criminal network, providing evidence for secondary prosecutions that will eliminate remaining threats to witness safety and royal authority. The systematic destruction of criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity for years demonstrated effectiveness of coordinated investigation, backed by royal authority and supported by a coalition of nobles whose integrity had been threatened by corrupt practices that undermined legitimate governance and honest commerce throughout territories that relied upon noble honor. As evening approached and final preparations commenced for legal proceedings that would formally conclude their investigation through judicial resolution, Kael reflected on the transformation of circumstances that had begun with a simple moral decision to protect someone under his care, and evolved into comprehensive reform of corrupt systems that had exploited vulnerable populations. The personal satisfaction came not from political victory over powerful enemies, but from knowledge that Rosalind's courage had inspired systematic change that would protect future generations from similar exploitation, while demonstrating that justice remained achievable through lawful means when supported by sufficient determination and strategic intelligence. The Alpha of Ravencrest had discovered that protecting individual dignity could reshape institutional relationships when backed by evidence and supported by allies whose commitment to principle transcended immediate self-interest or political convenience that might counsel compromise with systematic corruption. Chapter 10. The Price of Justice. The royal courtroom had been transformed into an arena for justice where the most significant trial of noble corruption in recent memory would determine whether privilege could be reformed through legal means or whether fundamental changes in power relationships were required to protect innocent people from systematic exploitation by those entrusted with authority to serve rather than abuse the vulnerable. Kael took his place among the assembled lords whose testimony would provide evidence of crimes spanning years of coordinated criminal behavior that had undermined legitimate governance, while enriching corrupt nobles through extortion, theft, and abuse of official positions for personal advancement at expense of royal authority and public welfare. Gareth Voss sat in chains that symbolized his fall from privileged position to criminal defendant facing charges that could result in execution for treason against royal authority, through systematic theft and corruption of administrative systems designed to protect rather than exploit innocent subjects who relied upon noble integrity for maintaining peace and prosperity. The prosecution's case unfolded with methodical precision that reflected months of careful investigation and evidence gathering, coordinated through multiple sources whose corroborating testimony created overwhelming proof of criminal conspiracy that even skilled advocates could not effectively challenge through procedural objections or character assassination designed to create reasonable doubt. 50,000 gold crowns stolen from crown resources intended for border fortifications, the royal prosecutor announced with a voice that carried throughout the chamber, where assembled nobles witnessed accountability for crimes that had threatened the foundation of legitimate governance. Systematic extortion of honest merchants conducting lawful commerce, sexual assault and intimidation of vulnerable individuals whose only crime was lacking political protection. Each charge was supported by documentary evidence and witness testimony that painted a comprehensive picture of criminal enterprise, operating through abuse of noble privilege and exploitation of legal systems designed to serve justice rather than protect systematic corruption from consequences that any ordinary subject would face for far lesser crimes. Rosalind's testimony commanded respectful attention from judges whose integrity had been carefully verified to ensure impartial evaluation of evidence without political considerations that might compromise objective assessment of criminal behavior, regardless of defendants' family connections or previous services that had earned protection under different circumstances. He claimed ownership over my person despite legal dissolution of betrothal contracts, she stated, with a voice that carried clearly throughout the chamber, where powerful nobles learned that victims could become witnesses whose courage transformed systematic abuse into criminal liability, requiring severe punishment. Used violence and intimidation to maintain control while threatening to destroy anyone who sought protection through official channels. The testimony revealed systematic patterns of behavior that transcended individual grievances to encompass fundamental questions about whether noble privilege included license to exploit those lacking resources for seeking justice through legal means, designed to protect the powerful, rather than serve vulnerable populations requiring safeguards against systematic oppression. Additional witnesses provided corroborating evidence that demonstrated the scope of criminal conspiracy extending throughout networks of corrupt officials whose coordination had enabled systematic theft and abuse to continue for years without detection or prosecution through normal administrative oversight that had been compromised by infiltration and intimidation. 23 victims, dozens of illegal transactions, coordination with criminal networks operating throughout the realm. The prosecutor summarized with satisfaction that reflected successful completion of investigation that had required extraordinary coordination between multiple jurisdictions and careful protection of witnesses whose lives had been threatened by enemies determined to prevent exposure of systematic corruption. The defense attempted to portray Gareth's crimes as isolated incidents of poor judgment rather than systematic criminal behavior requiring severe punishment, yet their arguments crumbled before overwhelming evidence of coordination and premeditation that demonstrated calculated exploitation of vulnerable individuals through abuse of official position and noble privilege. Lord Commander Willem Voss testified from his own chains, his admission of knowledge about his nephew's criminal activities providing final confirmation that corruption had penetrated highest levels of royal administration through family loyalty, that had prioritized personal relationships over official obligations to serve justice and protect innocent subjects from systematic abuse. I knew of irregular financial activities, but believed they represented personal indiscretions rather than systematic criminal behavior threatening royal authority, Willem stated, with a voice that carried shame of someone whose loyalty had been misplaced in service of family members whose crimes had betrayed everything he claimed to represent. The admission sealed Gareth's fate, while providing evidence for additional prosecutions that would eliminate remaining members of a criminal network whose coordination had enabled systematic exploitation to continue through intimidation and violence against anyone who dared challenge corrupt practices that violated fundamental principles governing legitimate relationships between authority and responsibility. As afternoon testimony concluded and judges retired to consider verdicts that would determine whether justice could triumph over privileged corruption through legal means, Kael reflected on the transformation of circumstances that had begun with simple moral decisions and evolved into comprehensive reform of institutional relationships that had failed to protect innocent people from systematic exploitation. The personal satisfaction came not from witnessing the enemy's destruction, but from knowledge that Rosalind's courage had inspired changes that would prevent future suffering, while demonstrating that individual actions could reshape political systems when supported by sufficient determination, and coordinated with allies whose commitment to principle transcended immediate self-interest. Tomorrow would bring verdicts that would determine whether legal resolution could achieve reform of corrupt practices, or whether deeper structural changes would be required to restore balance between power and responsibility that defined legitimate governance in civilized society where authority existed to protect rather than exploit those who depended upon noble integrity for their safety and welfare. The Alpha of Ravencrest had learned that protecting individual dignity could inspire systematic change when backed by evidence and supported by coalition, whose shared commitment to justice transcended political convenience or personal advancement through compromise with corruption, that threatened the foundation of everything they claimed to represent. Chapter 11: Verdicts and Consequences. The return of royal judges to the courtroom brought with it the weight of decisions that would reshape understanding of noble accountability throughout the realm, their solemn expressions reflecting careful consideration of evidence that had exposed systematic corruption, requiring responses that balanced justice with political stability, essential for maintaining legitimate governance. In the matter of Gareth Voss, accused of theft from royal resources, systematic extortion, and abuse of official position, the chief judge announced with voice that carried absolute authority throughout chamber, where assembled nobles witnessed accountability for crimes that had threatened foundational principles of lawful administration, we find the defendant guilty on all charges presented. The pronouncement struck the courtroom with force that transcended simple legal resolution to encompass recognition that noble privilege could not shield criminal behavior from consequences. When evidence was gathered with sufficient care and presented through proper channels that commanded respect from royal authorities committed to justice above political convenience. The sentence is forfeiture of all lands and titles, followed by exile from the realm under pain of death should the condemned ever return to territories where his crimes have brought dishonor upon noble obligations and betrayed royal trust. The judge continued with finality that closed chapter on systematic corruption while opening possibilities for reform of practices that had enabled exploitation of vulnerable populations. Kael felt satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal vindication, and everything to do with confirmation that legal systems could achieve justice when supported by sufficient evidence and coordinated through allies whose commitment to principle transcended immediate self-interest or political relationships that might counsel compromise with systematic corruption. Rosalind's quiet smile reflected transformation from terrified victim to confident woman, whose courage had inspired comprehensive reform while demonstrating that individual actions could reshape institutional relationships when backed by determination to speak truth, regardless of personal risk or potential consequences. In the matter of Willem Voss, former Lord Commander, accused of harboring criminals and obstruction of royal justice, the judge announced with tone that reflected particular gravity of charges against someone whose position had required absolute loyalty to royal authority above personal relationships that might compromise official obligations. We find the defendant guilty of criminal conspiracy through willful blindness to systematic abuse of authority. The conviction of such highly placed officials sent shockwaves throughout assembled nobility whose understanding of political relationships had been challenged by evidence that even the most trusted positions could be corrupted through family loyalty that prioritized personal advancement over service to royal interests and protection of innocent subjects. The sentence is permanent removal from all official positions and forfeiture of half his estates, with remaining properties held in trust for compensation of victims whose suffering resulted from his failure to fulfill official obligations that required investigation and prevention of systematic criminal behavior, the judge declared with authority that established precedent for accountability at highest levels of administration. The financial compensation for victims represented recognition that justice required more than simple punishment of criminals. It demanded acknowledgement of harm inflicted upon innocent people whose lives had been damaged through systematic exploitation enabled by official corruption and administrative failure, to protect vulnerable populations from abuse of noble privilege. Additional verdicts followed for network associates whose coordination had enabled systematic criminal behavior to operate with impunity for years, through intimidation and violence against anyone who dared challenge corrupt practices that violated fundamental principles governing legitimate relationships between authority and service to those who depended upon noble integrity. The Crown resources stolen through systematic fraud and corruption will be restored through liquidation of criminal assets, the Chief Judge announced, as proceedings concluded with a comprehensive resolution that addressed both punishment of crimes and restoration of damages inflicted upon royal authority and innocent victims whose suffering had been enabled by administrative failures. As the courtroom emptied and legal resolution provided the foundation for institutional reform designed to prevent future exploitation through improved oversight and accountability mechanisms, Kael found himself approached by Rosalind, whose presence reminded him that this victory had emerged from a simple moral decision to protect someone under his care. "Your Grace," she said, with a voice that carried gratitude, transcending formal acknowledgement of services rendered. "You risked everything to protect someone who had no claim upon your attention beyond simple human decency. I can never adequately express what your courage has meant to me and others who found strength through your example." The personal recognition struck him with unexpected emotional force as he realized how profoundly his understanding of leadership had been transformed through circumstances that began with observation of abuse and evolved into comprehensive questioning of his fundamental beliefs about maintaining emotional distance from personal attachments that might compromise objective judgment. "You found the courage to speak truth when silence would have been safer," he replied with conviction that surprised him with its intensity. "My role was simply providing protection that should have been available through normal channels designed to shield innocent people from systematic exploitation." The exchange reflected mutual recognition that their relationship had transcended formal boundaries between lord and servant to encompass something approaching genuine partnership in achieving justice that neither could have accomplished alone, he providing political resources and strategic intelligence, she contributing moral courage and willingness to risk everything for principle. "What happens now?" Rosalind asked with an expression that combined hope with uncertainty about future possibilities that had been opened through legal victory over systematic corruption. "Now, we rebuild," Kael replied with confidence that reflected a transformed understanding of his responsibilities as leader, whose authority existed to protect rather than exploit those who depended upon noble integrity. "Justice has been served, corruption has been exposed, and innocent people have been protected. The rest depends upon wisdom to prevent future abuse through institutional changes that serve vulnerable populations." As afternoon settled over Ravencrest Keep and news spread throughout the realm about comprehensive victory over systematic corruption that had threatened foundational principles of legitimate governance, Kael reflected on a journey that had begun with simple observation and evolved into fundamental questioning of everything he believed about leadership, responsibility, and the proper relationship between power and service to those who depended upon noble protection. The Alpha of Ravencrest had discovered that protecting individual dignity could inspire systematic change when backed by evidence and supported by allies whose shared commitment to justice transcended political convenience or personal advancement through compromise with forces that preferred exploitation over service to common welfare. Chapter 12. Unexpected Revelations. The private chamber where Kael met with Lord Fairfax following the trial's conclusion held an atmosphere of completion, mixed with anticipation for developments that would determine whether legal victory could inspire broader reforms throughout royal administration systems that had proven vulnerable to corruption through systematic exploitation of oversight mechanisms designed to prevent exactly this kind of criminal behavior. The investigation revealed more than simple corruption, Fairfax reported with expression that suggested additional discoveries requiring careful consideration of political implications extending beyond immediate legal resolution of Gareth's criminal enterprise. Financial records indicate coordination with enemies of the realm who have been systematically weakening border defenses through theft of crown resources intended for military fortification. The intelligence struck Kael with recognition that their investigation had exposed threats to national security that transcended domestic corruption to encompass possible treason involving coordination with foreign powers whose interests would be served by weakening royal authority through systematic undermining of administrative integrity and military preparedness. The breadth of their cooperation, he pressed, realizing that evidence of outside participation would transform their legal success into a platform for investigating wider, treasonous activities, possibly embedded within government layers, whose dedication to the monarchy had been assumed without thorough verification procedures. Substantial enough to suggest systematic penetration of royal administration by agents whose objectives include destabilization of legitimate governance through corruption and theft, Fairfax replied grimly. The stolen funds were channeled through networks that extend beyond simple criminal enterprise into activities that serve foreign intelligence operations designed to weaken our defensive capabilities. The revelation provided context for the systematic nature of opposition they had encountered during investigation. Enemies had been motivated by more than simple desire to protect individual criminal behavior, but by recognition that exposure of corruption could lead to discovery of treasonous conspiracy that threatened national security through systematic betrayal of royal trust and military resources. Rosalind's safety? Kael inquired with concern, that transcended professional obligation to encompass personal attachment, that had developed through circumstances challenging his fundamental beliefs about maintaining emotional distance from relationships that might compromise objective judgment in situations requiring strategic rather than emotional responses. Secured through royal protection that extends beyond simple witness safety to encompass recognition of her service in exposing threats to national security. Fairfax confirmed with satisfaction that reflected appreciation for courage that had enabled discovery of systematic conspiracy through willingness to speak truth, despite personal risk and potential consequences. The formal acknowledgement of Rosalind's contribution represented more than simple gratitude for testimony. It constituted official recognition that individual courage could serve national interests when supported by institutional commitment to justice above political convenience or administrative expedience that might counsel compromise with systematic corruption. Your own position has been significantly enhanced through this investigation, Fairfax observed with a tone that suggested political opportunities emerging from successful resolution of crises that had tested local authority while demonstrating effectiveness of strategic intelligence and principled leadership in achieving justice, through legal means rather than private warfare. The comment reminded Kael that political consequences of their victory extended beyond simple vindication of his judgment to encompass enhanced reputation for integrity and effectiveness that would strengthen his influence within royal administration while opening possibilities for expanded authority in addressing similar problems throughout the realm. Yet personal satisfaction came not from political advancement, but from knowledge that protection of individual dignity had inspired systematic reform while demonstrating that moral principles could guide effective action in complex circumstances, requiring balance between strategic wisdom and ethical commitment to serving those who depended upon noble protection from systematic exploitation. There will be additional investigations, Fairfax continued, extending throughout networks revealed through financial records and witness testimony that documented coordination between domestic corruption and foreign intelligence operations designed to weaken royal authority through systematic theft and administrative penetration. The prospect of broader reform, inspired by their successful investigation, represented vindication of methodical approach to evidence gathering and strategic coordination with allies, whose shared commitment to justice had overcome systematic opposition from enemies who had underestimated power of truth when supported by sufficient determination and institutional backing. My recommendation would be appointment to the Royal Commission tasked with comprehensive reform of oversight mechanisms designed to prevent future penetration by foreign agents operating through corruption of administrative systems. Fairfax suggested with expression that indicated serious consideration of Kael's qualifications for expanded authority based upon demonstrated effectiveness in complex investigation, requiring diplomatic sensitivity and strategic intelligence. The offer represented recognition that his skills in analysis and coordination could serve national interests beyond local boundaries, yet acceptance would require leaving Ravencrest for extended periods that might compromise his ability to provide personal attention to responsibilities that had shaped his understanding of leadership as service to those who depended upon noble protection. "I'm honored by your confidence," Kael replied carefully. "Yet my obligations to those under my protection must remain primary consideration in decisions about expanded service to royal interests that might conflict with local responsibilities requiring personal attention and direct oversight." The response reflected a transformed understanding of authority as a relationship, rather than simply position. Recognition that effective leadership required emotional investment in welfare of those who depended upon noble integrity rather than mere administrative efficiency, that treated subjects as abstract resources requiring management rather than individuals deserving personal consideration and protection. As evening settled over Ravencrest Keep and implications of legal victory continued expanding through revelations of broader conspiracy that had threatened national security through systematic corruption, Kael understood that his journey from emotional detachment to personal commitment had prepared him for challenges requiring both strategic intelligence and moral courage in service of principles that transcended immediate self-interest. The Alpha of Ravencrest had learned that protecting individual dignity could inspire institutional reform when backed by evidence and supported by allies whose shared values provided foundation for systematic change that served justice above political convenience or administrative expedients that might compromise fundamental obligations to those who trusted noble authority to serve their welfare rather than exploit their vulnerability. Chapter 13. The Heart's Rebellion. The letter from the royal court arrived on a morning when autumn mist clung to Ravencrest Keep's towers like memories of summer warmth reluctant to surrender to winter's approach. Kael broke the royal seal with movements that had become automatic, The urgent dispatch arrived at dawn with the thunder of exhausted horses and the grim efficiency of messengers who had ridden through the night to deliver intelligence that would transform Kael's understanding of threats facing those he had left behind, while pursuing military objectives that seemed increasingly insignificant compared to immediate dangers requiring his personal intervention and protection. The royal seal was intact, yet the message within bore Marcus's emergency script rather than official correspondence, suggesting circumstances that had escalated beyond normal administrative channels into crisis, requiring immediate response from local authority, that transcended conventional military chain of command or campaign obligations to royal service. Rosalind has been arrested on charges of witchcraft and sedition. The message began with bluntness that struck Kael like a physical blow, transforming tactical concerns about rebel suppression into desperate urgency for someone whose safety had become more important than military success or political advancement through service to crown interests. The accusation revealed sophisticated understanding of how to attack someone whose social vulnerability made her susceptible to charges that aristocratic enemies could never face. Witchcraft allegations provided a legal framework for eliminating inconvenient individuals while avoiding direct confrontation with local authority that might trigger military response or political retaliation. Sir William and Lord Pemberton have coordinated testimony from servants claiming supernatural influence over household decisions and inappropriate authority exercised through unnatural means. Marcus continued with a tone that suggested systematic conspiracy rather than spontaneous accusations arising from genuine concern about administrative irregularities or social improprieties. The charges represented calculated assault upon their relationship while exploiting prejudices about appropriate roles for women, whose social backgrounds differed from conventional expectations regarding noble authority and traditional qualifications for managing local affairs during extended absence, requiring delegation of administrative responsibilities. Evidence presented includes unusual loyalty shown by staff members towards someone whose elevation above traditional station supposedly demonstrates enchantment rather than earned respect. The report continued with details that revealed how enemies had twisted positive outcomes of effective leadership into proof of supernatural manipulation, requiring immediate intervention by religious authorities. Kael's hands trembled with rage as he recognized a pattern of systematic character assassination that echoed previous attempts to silence witnesses through intimidation and legal manipulation, designed to achieve objectives that direct confrontation could not accomplish against someone protected by local authority and witnessed competence. Royal investigators arrived yesterday with writs of examination signed by court officials who claim authority superseding local jurisdiction. Marcus added with information that confirmed fears about political coordination between external enemies and religious authorities, whose involvement provided legitimacy for charges that might otherwise be dismissed as personal vendettas or administrative disputes. The legal framework transformed personal attack into official proceedings that could result in execution for crimes that existed only in the imagination of enemies seeking to destroy relationships that challenged social conventions, while demonstrating effectiveness of leadership based upon character rather than inherited privilege or strategic marriage alliances. She maintains dignity despite imprisonment conditions designed to break resistance and force confession of supernatural practices. Marcus reported with admiration that reflected his observation of courage under circumstances that would have destroyed individuals lacking her resilience and determination to maintain innocence despite systematic pressure. Timeline for trial proceedings? Kael demanded of his aide-de-camp, recognizing that immediate departure from the campaign might be necessary to provide protection that legal representation alone could not achieve against charges specifically designed to exploit social prejudices and religious fears about female authority exercised outside traditional boundaries. Unknown, Your Grace, came the reply that confirmed worst fears about judicial proceedings that could be manipulated through political pressure and religious authority to achieve predetermined outcomes, regardless of evidence or testimony that might contradict accusations based upon prejudice rather than factual investigation. The realization that Rosalind faced immediate mortal danger while he pursued military objectives hundreds of miles away, triggered protective instincts that transcended duty to crown service or campaign obligations, that had previously defined his understanding of honor and responsibility to broader interests requiring personal sacrifice. Prepare immediate departure with escort sufficient for forced march to Ravencrest, he commanded with voice that carried absolute authority, despite recognition that abandoning military campaign could result in charges of desertion or dereliction of duty that might destroy his political position while failing to save someone whose welfare had become more important than conventional measures of success. "Your Grace," his aide protested with concern that reflected military understanding of consequences for leaving assigned duties during an active campaign against rebellion that threatened royal authority. Departure without royal permission could be interpreted as abandonment of command responsibilities, requiring court-martial and potential execution for military crimes. The warning contained truth that Kael couldn't dismiss. Choosing personal obligation over military duty represented exactly the kind of emotional compromise that his father had warned against. Yet continuing the campaign while Rosalind faced execution for crimes that existed only in enemies' imagination violated everything he had learned about protecting those who mattered most. "Some responsibilities transcend military orders," he replied with conviction that surprised him with its intensity. "Authority exists to protect those who depend upon our integrity, not to serve abstract interests that require sacrificing individual dignity for strategic objectives that lose meaning when divorced from personal commitment to specific outcomes affecting particular people." The decision marked a complete transformation, from dutiful soldier following orders regardless of personal cost into a leader whose authority derived from emotional investment in those whose welfare required protection above conventional obligations or political advancement that might be achieved through service to royal interests. As dawn preparations commenced for departure, that would test whether love could overcome institutional power when backed by sufficient determination to risk everything for principles that transcended immediate self-interest, Kael understood that his greatest battle was not against military enemies, but against systematic forces that preferred destroying inconvenient individuals to allowing change that challenged established privilege and traditional authority relationships. The Alpha of Ravencrest was abandoning military glory for personal commitment, political advancement for emotional truth, and strategic calculation for moral courage that honored relationships more precious than reputation or conventional measures of noble success that might be gained through compromise with forces that valued power above justice and convenience above integrity. Chapter 14. The Choice That Defines. The royal summons lay open on Kael's desk like a door to destiny, its gilt edges catching morning light that streamed through windows overlooking lands he had governed with methodical precision for 15 years. Yet, as he studied the formal language that would reshape his life's trajectory, internal rebellion grew against everything he had been taught about duty, advancement, and the price of maintaining emotional distance from those whose welfare had become more important than political achievement. "You must accept," his steward Aldrich counseled during morning consultations that had traditionally focused on administrative efficiency rather than moral quandaries that challenged fundamental assumptions about leadership and service. Chief Royal Investigator represents the pinnacle of political achievement. Refusing such honor would be interpreted as rejection of royal confidence in your capabilities. The practical wisdom made sense from conventional perspectives on noble ambition and strategic positioning within court hierarchies, that determined influence and resources available for serving broader interests that transcended local obligations and personal attachments that might compromise objective judgment in complex situations requiring dispassionate analysis. Yet Kael found himself thinking not of political advancement, but of Rosalind's quiet courage in speaking truth despite personal risk, the way her presence had transformed his understanding of why authority existed, and the recognition that protecting individual dignity had become more meaningful than abstract service to royal interests that might require sacrificing those who depended upon his personal commitment to their welfare. "There are considerations beyond political convenience," he replied, with a tone that revealed internal conflict between learned priorities and emotional discoveries that had emerged through circumstances challenging his carefully cultivated detachment from personal investment in specific outcomes affecting particular individuals rather than statistical populations. "Your Grace," Aldrich pressed with concern that reflected years of loyal service and deep understanding of political realities that governed noble success within systems rewarding strategic thinking over sentimental attachment. "Declining royal appointment sends a message about your priorities that could damage relationships essential for maintaining local authority and territorial security." The warning contained truth that Kael couldn't dismiss. Refusing the king's offer would suggest either incompetence unworthy of such honor or personal considerations that placed individual desires above service to crown interests requiring absolute loyalty and commitment to broader welfare that transcended local attachments and emotional complications. A messenger's arrival interrupted their discussion with intelligence that would affect his decision in ways that neither political calculation nor personal preference could have anticipated. Sir Garrett entered with an expression that combined urgency with satisfaction at news that would resolve conflicts between competing obligations through external developments requiring immediate response. "Reports from the eastern borders, Your Grace," Garrett announced with a tone that suggested military implications affecting territorial security. "Lord Blackthorn has declared rebellion against royal authority, claiming legitimacy through alliance with foreign powers that promise support for establishing an independent kingdom, free from crown taxation and administrative oversight." The intelligence struck Kael with recognition that political stability he had helped preserve through exposure of systematic corruption was now threatened by military challenge requiring responses that transcended investigation into active defense of legitimate governance against enemies who preferred conquest to reform of corrupt practices through legal means. "Royal forces?" he inquired with strategic thinking that had guided his responses to crises throughout 15 years of local leadership. "Insufficient for immediate response," Garrett replied grimly. "The king requests that loyal lords mobilize their forces for a campaign that will determine whether rebellion can be suppressed before foreign allies provide military support that could destabilize the entire realm." The military summons transformed his situation by providing alternatives to royal appointment that served crown interests while allowing him to remain within his domain, where personal obligations and emotional attachments could be honored without appearing to reject royal confidence in his capabilities and loyalty to legitimate governance. "Timeline for mobilization?" Kael asked with relief that a political solution had emerged to resolve conflict between advancement opportunity and personal commitment to those whose welfare depended upon his presence rather than distant oversight through appointed representatives who might lack understanding of local circumstances requiring individual attention. 2 weeks for preparation, followed by campaign duration depending upon enemy resistance and foreign intervention that could extend conflict beyond simple suppression of domestic rebellion into broader warfare requiring sustained commitment of resources and strategic coordination. Garrett explained with military precision that reflected understanding of challenges ahead. The prospect of extended military campaigns provided justification for declining court appointments that couldn't be interpreted as rejection of royal service or evidence of divided loyalty to crown interests, requiring absolute commitment above personal considerations that might compromise effectiveness in positions demanding complete dedication to abstract principles rather than individual welfare. Yet deciding between court appointment and military service revealed how profoundly his priorities had changed during recent months. Where once he would have calculated strategic advantages of each option, now he found himself considering which choice would allow continued protection of those who had come to matter more than political advancement or conventional measures of noble success. Prepare for campaign mobilization, he decided with certainty that surprised him. Send word to the king that Alpha Ravencrest chooses military service over administrative appointment, believing that direct action against rebellion serves royal interests more effectively than investigative duties that others could perform with equal competence. The decision represented more than choice between competing forms of royal service. It constituted recognition that his understanding of leadership had evolved beyond abstract obligation into personal commitment to those whose welfare required presence, rather than advancement to positions of greater influence that demanded emotional distance from individual circumstances. As afternoon preparations began for a military campaign that would determine whether legitimate governance could survive challenges from enemies who preferred conquest to reform of corrupt practices, Kael acknowledged that he had chosen principle over advancement, personal commitment over political opportunity, and emotional truth over strategic calculation that had previously guided his decisions. The Alpha of Ravencrest was preparing for war, yet his greatest victory had already been achieved through recognition that protecting those who mattered transcended conventional ambition or abstract service to interests that might require sacrificing individual dignity for administrative efficiency or political convenience. The choice had been made, and it reflected transformation from emotionally distant ruler into leader whose authority derived from personal commitment to those who trusted his protection rather than simple adherence to formal obligations that might be fulfilled through institutional mechanisms, rather than individual investment in specific outcomes affecting particular people whose welfare had become essential to his own sense of moral legitimacy. Chapter 15. The Confession. Evening settled over Ravencrest Keep with the weight of unspoken words that had accumulated during months of careful navigation between duty and desire, formal obligation and personal attachment that had challenged every assumption Kael held about maintaining emotional distance from those whose welfare had become more important than political advancement or strategic positioning within court hierarchies. The campaign would begin within days, taking him away from his domain for months of military service that would test his physical courage, while providing respite from emotional complications that had emerged through circumstances he had never anticipated, when simple observation of abuse had evolved into fundamental questioning of everything he believed about leadership and responsibility. Rosalind had requested a private audience to discuss arrangements for her security during his absence. Yet, as she entered his chambers with quiet dignity that reflected transformation from terrified victim into confident woman, Kael understood that their conversation would address more than administrative concerns, requiring practical solutions. "Your Grace," she began with a voice that carried warmth transcending formal acknowledgement of his protection, while revealing emotional investment that challenged boundaries between lord and subject that had traditionally governed their interactions despite growing recognition of mutual regard that neither had explicitly acknowledged. "Rosalind," he replied with a tone that invited honesty rather than diplomatic courtesy. "Speak freely about whatever concerns you may have regarding arrangements during my absence or any other matters requiring attention, before campaign duties demand my departure from those who have become—" He paused, struggling to find words that honored truth without violating propriety. "Important to you?" she suggested with gentle understanding that revealed her awareness of changes in his behavior and decision-making that had moved beyond strategic calculation, to encompass emotional investment in outcomes affecting specific individuals rather than abstract populations requiring efficient management. The phrase hung between them like a bridge-spanning chasm that had separated formal distance from personal attachment, offering opportunity for crossing into territory that challenged everything he had been taught about maintaining professional boundaries that protected objective judgment from sentimental complications that might compromise effectiveness in positions requiring dispassionate analysis. "Yes," he admitted with simplicity that carried more weight than elaborate explanations could have conveyed. "You have become important to me in ways that transcend feudal obligation or administrative responsibility. Your welfare matters to me personally, not simply as a duty to protect those under my authority." The confession emerged with certainty that surprised him, representing acknowledgement of emotional reality that had developed despite his lifetime of training in strategic thinking and calculated responses to complex situations requiring balance between competing interests and obligations. "I know," she replied, with a smile that illuminated her features while revealing an understanding that had grown through observation of his actions, rather than formal declarations that might have seemed inappropriate given differences in their social positions and traditional expectations governing relationships between nobility and those who served within local households. "When I first saw those bruises," Kael continued with growing confidence in speaking truth that had been suppressed through conventional wisdom about maintaining emotional distance, "something changed inside me that I didn't recognize or understand. The protective anger I felt transcended simple feudal obligation to become personal commitment to your safety and happiness." The explanation revealed internal transformation that had occurred gradually through circumstances that challenged his fundamental beliefs about leadership, authority, and the proper relationship between power and service to those who depended upon noble protection from systematic exploitation and abuse. "You risked everything to protect someone who had no claim upon your attention beyond common human decency," Rosalind observed with gratitude that transcended simple acknowledgement of services rendered. "Your courage inspired others to speak truth despite personal risk, transforming systematic abuse into criminal liability requiring severe punishment." Her recognition of broader implications affecting other victims reminded Kael that their relationship had emerged from principles rather than simple personal attraction, suggesting foundation for something deeper than romantic attachment based upon shared commitment to justice and protection of vulnerable individuals, requiring safeguards against systematic oppression. "The investigation revealed more than corruption," he admitted with recognition that their cooperation had achieved outcomes neither could have accomplished alone. "It showed me that authority exists to serve individual dignity rather than abstract efficiency, that effective leadership requires emotional investment in specific outcomes, affecting particular people whose welfare becomes personal responsibility rather than administrative obligation." The philosophical acknowledgement reflected a transformation of his understanding of power and responsibility that had emerged through circumstances testing every assumption about maintaining professional distance from personal attachments that might compromise objective judgment in complex situations requiring strategic responses. "What happens when you return from campaign?" Rosalind asked, with expression that combined hope with uncertainty about future possibilities that had been opened through legal victory over systematic corruption while challenging traditional boundaries between social classes and conventional expectations governing relationships within feudal hierarchies. The question touched upon complications that Kael had been avoiding through focus on immediate military obligations that provided temporary escape from emotional decisions, requiring commitment to relationships that transcended formal boundaries between lord and subject, while honoring principles that had guided their cooperation in achieving justice. "That depends upon whether you would consider accepting a position that honors your contributions while acknowledging changed circumstances that have developed between us," he replied carefully, recognizing that his proposal would challenge social conventions while offering an opportunity for formalizing relationships that had already transcended traditional categories. "What kind of position?" she asked with curiosity that suggested openness to possibilities he had been contemplating during sleepless nights, when military preparation provided distraction from emotional recognition that had grown beyond simple attraction into something approaching genuine partnership. "Chatelaine of Ravencrest Keep," he suggested with a voice that carried conviction, despite uncertainty about her response to an offer that would elevate her status, while acknowledging abilities she had demonstrated through courage and intelligence during investigation that had required diplomatic sensitivity and strategic understanding. "With authority over household management and responsibility for coordinating social welfare programs that protect vulnerable populations from systematic exploitation." The offer acknowledged her talents and their emotional ties, while establishing a proper social framework for a connection that had grown past normal boundaries due to their mutual commitment to ideals above personal gain or strategic convenience. "You're offering me authority over your household?" she asked with amazement that reflected recognition of trust and respect represented by positions traditionally reserved for noble-born women whose family connections provided political advantages rather than demonstrated competence in managing complex administrative responsibilities. "I'm offering you partnership," Kael corrected with certainty that surprised him. "Marriage if you'll accept a proposal from someone whose understanding of love has been transformed through learning that protecting what matters most requires courage to risk everything for principles that transcend political convenience or strategic advantage." The confession emerged with emotional honesty that represented complete departure from calculated responses that had characterized his approach to personal relationships throughout adult life, devoted to maintaining professional distance from attachments that might compromise objective judgment in complex situations requiring dispassionate analysis. Chapter 16. The Promise Made. The silence that followed Kael's proposal stretched like morning mist over mountain valleys, filled with possibility and uncertainty that reflected the unprecedented nature of what he had offered. Not simply marriage across social boundaries, but genuine partnership built upon shared principles and mutual respect that had emerged through circumstances testing their courage and commitment to justice. Rosalind's expression revealed internal struggle between hope and disbelief, as if she couldn't quite accept that someone with power would risk social censure and political complications for a relationship that challenged conventional expectations about noble marriages serving strategic alliances, rather than personal attachment that transcended calculated advancement through careful selection of partners providing territorial or financial advantages. "Your Grace," she began with a voice that trembled slightly, "are you certain about what you're proposing? Marriage between an alpha and former servant would scandalize court society, while providing ammunition for political enemies who might use unconventional choices to question your judgment in other matters, requiring respect from peers and subordinates." The practical concerns revealed an understanding of realities that Kael had been avoiding through focus on emotional truth, rather than political consequences that could affect his authority and effectiveness in positions requiring confidence from those who might interpret personal choices as evidence of compromised judgment or inappropriate priorities that placed individual desires above responsibilities to broader interests. "I am certain," he replied with conviction that surprised him with its intensity, "that some principles matter more than political convenience or social approval from those whose opinions are based upon convention, rather than understanding of what makes authority legitimate through service to those who depend upon noble protection." The declaration represented a complete departure from strategic thinking that had guided his decisions for 15 years of local leadership, focused on maintaining stability through careful balance of competing interests and obligations that required diplomatic sensitivity to relationships with other nobles whose support was essential for territorial security and administrative effectiveness. "But your position, your reputation, your influence within royal circles," she pressed with concern that demonstrated understanding of potential costs that his unconventional choice might impose upon capabilities for serving broader interests that transcended personal happiness, while requiring respect from political allies whose cooperation was essential for achieving beneficial outcomes. "Will survive whatever criticism results from choosing love over political convenience," Kael assured her with confidence that reflected a transformed understanding of what constituted legitimate authority. "My effectiveness as leader derives from commitment to protecting those who depend upon noble integrity, not from conformity to social expectations that value strategic marriage over personal integrity." The response revealed how profoundly his priorities had shifted during months of questioning fundamental assumptions about leadership and responsibility that had been shaped by his father's counsel about maintaining emotional distance from attachments that might compromise objective judgment in complex situations, requiring dispassionate analysis of competing claims and obligations. "You could lose everything," Rosalind observed with expression that combined gratitude for his offer with realistic assessment of risks that unconventional marriage would create for someone whose political position depended upon respect from peers who might interpret personal choices as evidence of judgment affected by emotional considerations rather than strategic wisdom. I could lose everything worth having if I allow political calculation to override recognition of what matters most, he corrected with emotional honesty that represented acknowledgement of truth that had been growing throughout their relationship. Power without purpose becomes mere ambition. Authority without love becomes oppression. Leadership without personal investment in those who depend upon protection becomes administrative efficiency that serves abstract interests rather than individual dignity. The philosophical explanation revealed a transformation of his understanding of authority that had emerged through circumstances testing every assumption about maintaining professional boundaries between personal desires and official obligations that required service to broader interests, transcending individual attachment or emotional investment in specific outcomes affecting particular people. Your answer doesn't require immediate decision, Kael continued, with recognition that his proposal had created a situation requiring careful consideration of implications extending beyond personal happiness to encompass questions about social responsibility and political consequences that could affect others who depended upon local authority for protection and prosperity. Campaign duties will provide time for reflection about whether you can accept partnership with someone whose priorities have been fundamentally changed through learning what it means to love someone more than position or reputation. The admission of love emerged naturally despite his lifetime of training in strategic communication that avoided emotional revelation that might create vulnerability or suggest weakness that enemies could exploit for political advantage or personal attack. Designed to undermine authority through character assassination or scandal that discredited judgment and effectiveness. I don't need time, Rosalind replied, with a smile that transformed her features while revealing certainty that matched his own emotional recognition. I have been observing changes in your behavior and decision-making for months, watching someone learn to balance duty with humanity, authority with compassion, strategic wisdom with moral courage. The man who risked everything to protect someone he barely knew has become someone I respect, admire, and love. The declaration struck Kael with emotional force that confirmed his understanding that their relationship had transcended conventional boundaries through shared commitment to principles rather than simple attraction or strategic convenience that might characterize marriages designed to advance political interests rather than honor personal attachment, based upon mutual recognition of character and values. Then we will be married upon my return from campaign, he declared with certainty that reflected complete commitment to a relationship that challenged social conventions while honoring truth that had emerged through circumstances testing their courage and determination to serve justice above personal safety or political advancement. The estate requires management during your absence, Rosalind observed with practical understanding that their engagement created immediate administrative obligations requiring attention, before military duties demanded his departure from responsibilities that couldn't be neglected without affecting welfare of those who depended upon local oversight and protection. You will serve as Chatelaine beginning immediately, Kael decided, with recognition that formal appointment would provide her with authority necessary for managing household affairs, while establishing precedent for expanded responsibilities that marriage would bring. Marcus will coordinate military preparations, while you oversee civilian administration and social welfare programs that protect vulnerable populations from systematic exploitation. The arrangement honored both her capabilities and their emotional connection, while providing a practical framework for partnership that would serve as state interests during extended absence required by campaign obligations that might last months depending upon enemy resistance and foreign intervention that could complicate military resolution of rebellion threatening legitimate governance. As evening deepened and final preparations commenced for departure that would test their commitment through separation and military dangers that could affect their future together, Kael understood that his proposal had represented more than personal declaration. It constituted recognition that effective leadership required emotional investment in those whose welfare had become more important than political advancement or conventional measures of noble success. The Alpha of Ravencrest had chosen love over strategic convenience, personal truth over political calculation, and emotional honesty over professional distance that had previously characterized his approach to relationships and responsibilities, that defined his understanding of authority and service to those who trusted his protection. Chapter 17. Departure and Doubt. Dawn brought with it the martial sounds of army preparation that had echoed through Ravencrest Keep's courtyards for generations, the ring of steel being sharpened, the creak of leather harness being fitted, the rhythmic stamp of horses eager for movement after days of careful provisioning and equipment inspection, that transformed peaceful castle into military staging ground for campaign that would determine rebellion's fate. Kael stood in his chamber overlooking organized chaos below, his mind cycling between tactical considerations that would affect his force's effectiveness during upcoming battles and personal concerns about leaving Rosalind to manage estate responsibilities while facing social challenges that his unconventional proposal would create among nobles whose approval had previously seemed essential for maintaining political stability. The engagement ring he had commissioned from the castle's master craftsman caught morning light as he turned it between his fingers. A simple band of gold set with sapphire that matched her eyes, designed to symbolize commitment that transcended social boundaries while honoring beauty that had inspired transformation of his understanding about authority, responsibility, and the proper relationship between power and service to those who depended upon noble protection. "Your Grace," Marcus announced from the doorway. "Final preparations are complete. The men await your inspection before departure." The captain's tone carried military precision that masked personal concern about leaving the estate under management of someone whose capabilities, while demonstrated through the recent crisis, had never been tested in administrative responsibilities requiring diplomatic sensitivity and strategic understanding of complex relationships between competing interests and obligations. "Rosalind's authority has been formally established?" Kael inquired, recognizing that legal documentation would be essential for ensuring her decisions were respected by household staff and local officials who might question orders from someone whose social background differed from traditional expectations about noble authority and appropriate qualifications for managing local affairs. "All necessary writs have been prepared and witnessed," Marcus confirmed. "Yet your Grace should understand that some members of the household and local nobility may require time to adjust to changed circumstances that challenge conventional expectations about appropriate leadership qualifications." The diplomatic warning reflected realistic assessment of social dynamics that could create difficulties for Rosalind during his absence, particularly if political enemies chose to exploit unconventional arrangements for propaganda purposes, designed to undermine local authority through scandal or controversy that questioned judgment and priorities. "She has proven her courage and intelligence through circumstances that tested both qualities beyond normal expectations," Kael replied, with conviction that had grown through months of observing her transformation from terrified victim into confident woman whose insights had contributed essential elements to successful investigation of systematic corruption. "Administrative competence can be learned, but integrity and wisdom cannot be taught to those who lack natural capacity for understanding how power should serve those who depend upon protection." The defense revealed how thoroughly his assessment criteria had changed during recent months, where once he had valued conventional qualifications and social credentials that provided political advantages, now he prioritized character and commitment to principles that transcended personal advancement or strategic convenience that might counsel compromise with systematic exploitation. A soft knock interrupted their discussion, as morning duties brought a familiar presence that had become central to Kael's understanding of why he was willing to risk everything for a relationship that challenged social conventions, while honoring emotional truth that had emerged through circumstances testing courage and determination to serve justice above political considerations. "Your Grace," Rosalind announced with a voice that carried confidence earned through surviving systematic persecution, while inspiring others to speak truth despite personal risk, The household staff has assembled for your final instructions before departure." Her presence reminded him of the transformation that had occurred since first witnessing evidence of abuse, not simply her growth from victim to leader, but his own evolution from emotionally distant administrator into someone whose authority derived from personal commitment to those who trusted his protection, rather than simple adherence to formal obligations that could be fulfilled through institutional mechanisms. "We should address them together," he decided, with recognition that public acknowledgement of her authority would be essential for ensuring respect during his absence while demonstrating his confidence in capabilities that others might question based upon social prejudice rather than demonstrated competence and integrity. The great hall was filled with assembled servants, guards, and local officials whose expressions revealed a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty about changed circumstances that challenged traditional expectations regarding appropriate leadership qualifications and social boundaries that had previously governed relationships between nobility and those who served within local households. "During my absence, Chatelaine Rosalind will exercise full authority over estate administration and household management," Kael announced with a tone that brooked no challenge to arrangements that had been carefully planned to ensure continuity of effective governance while honoring capabilities that had been proven through recent crises requiring courage and intelligence. The formal title and explicit delegation of authority established the legal framework for her decisions while providing social legitimacy that conventional marriage would eventually formalize through recognition that their relationship transcended personal attachment to encompass genuine partnership in serving those who depended upon local protection and administrative competence. "Her word carries the same weight as my own in all matters affecting estate welfare and household security," he continued with emphasis that made clear any disrespect toward her authority would be interpreted as a challenge to his own judgment and leadership that demanded absolute loyalty from those who served within his domain. The assembled staff responded with appropriate acknowledgement, yet Kael detected undercurrents of reservation that reflected social conditioning about proper relationships between classes and conventional expectations, about noble marriages serving strategic alliances rather than personal attachment that transcended calculated advancement through careful selection of partners. As the final arrangements were completed and their departure drew near, Kael found himself alone with Rosalind in the chamber that had seen their relationship evolve from professional formality to personal closeness, fundamentally challenging his beliefs about maintaining proper boundaries between those in power and those under their care. "Are you certain about leaving estate management in my hands?" she asked with an expression that combined confidence in her abilities with realistic understanding of challenges that unconventional arrangements would create among those whose cooperation was essential for effective administration during extended absence. "I am certain," he replied with conviction that surprised him with its intensity, "that you possess wisdom and integrity necessary for protecting those who depend upon local authority while serving principles that matter more than social approval or political convenience." The departure was approaching, yet Kael understood that his greatest battle had already been won through recognition that some relationships transcended conventional boundaries when built upon shared commitment to justice and mutual respect that honored individual dignity above strategic calculation or administrative efficiency that treated people as abstract resources rather than individuals deserving personal consideration and protection. Chapter 18. The Test of Distance. 3 weeks into the campaign against Lord Blackthorn's rebellion, Kael received his first correspondence from Ravencrest Keep with anticipation that had surprised him in its intensity. Military duties had provided temporary distraction from emotional complications, yet evening hours in the command tent brought inevitable thoughts of Rosalind and concerns about challenges she might be facing in establishing authority over those whose cooperation was essential for effective estate management. The letter bore her careful script alongside Marcus's military reports, suggesting coordination between civilian and security administration that demonstrated political wisdom beyond her years, while confirming his confidence in capabilities that had been tested through recent crises, requiring courage and diplomatic sensitivity to navigate complex relationships between competing interests and obligations. Estate finances remain stable through careful management of resources and strategic allocation of funds for harvest activities and winter preparations. She reported with precision that revealed natural aptitude for administrative oversight that transcended formal education to encompass intuitive understanding of economic relationships and social dynamics affecting community welfare and prosperity. Relief flooded through him as he recognized evidence of competent leadership that was maintaining stability during his absence, while protecting vulnerable populations from potential exploitation by those who might attempt to take advantage of changed circumstances or unconventional arrangements that challenged traditional expectations about appropriate authority qualifications. However, the letter continued with honesty that he had come to value above diplomatic courtesy. Certain members of the local nobility have questioned arrangements that place estate management under authority of someone whose social background differs from conventional expectations. Lord Pemberton has been particularly vocal in expressing concerns about precedent that might encourage similar departures from traditional practices. The intelligence confirmed his fears about political opposition that would inevitably emerge from those whose interests were threatened by recognition that effective leadership could transcend social boundaries when based upon demonstrated competence rather than inherited privilege or strategic marriages designed to advance family interests through calculated alliances. Sir William arrived yesterday with a delegation claiming royal authority to inspect administrative arrangements and verify compliance with proper procedures. The letter added with a tone that suggested growing challenges requiring diplomatic sensitivity while maintaining local authority against interference from outside forces seeking to exploit his absence for political advantage. Concern sharpened into protective anger as Kael recognized a pattern of intimidation that echoed systematic opposition they had faced during investigation of corruption, enemies who preferred administrative manipulation to direct confrontation while using official channels to achieve objectives that couldn't be accomplished through legitimate means or honest evaluation of circumstances. Marcus has been invaluable in coordinating security while respecting civilian authority. Rosalind continued with gratitude that reflected the understanding of delicate balance required for maintaining stability during the transition period when unconventional arrangements were being tested by those who wished to see them fail for political or ideological reasons. The cooperation between his captain and his betrothed demonstrated wisdom in delegating complementary responsibilities while maintaining unified command structure that could respond effectively to challenges requiring both military readiness and diplomatic finesse in managing relationships with local officials whose support was essential for long-term stability. Yet beneath professional reporting, he detected emotional strain that reminded him of the isolation she had experienced during systematic persecution by enemies, who had used her vulnerability as a weapon against those who sought to protect innocent people from exploitation and abuse through violence and intimidation. "I miss your presence more than seems appropriate for someone who should be focused entirely on administrative duties," she admitted with honesty, that pierced through military detachment he had been cultivating to maintain effectiveness during campaign operations that required strategic thinking rather than emotional distraction from personal concerns. The simple confession struck him with force that confirmed his understanding that their relationship had transcended conventional boundaries to become an essential element of his identity and purpose. As leader whose authority derived from personal commitment to those who mattered most, rather than abstract service to administrative efficiency or political advancement. Your letters provide strength during moments when challenges seem overwhelming, and opposition appears designed to prove that unconventional choices inevitably result in failure, she continued with vulnerability that revealed ongoing struggle against forces that sought to undermine confidence through systematic pressure designed to create appearance of incompetence or inappropriate elevation above proper social station. Reading her words while surrounded by campaign preparations and military concerns that demanded immediate attention, Kael felt protective instincts that transcended physical distance to encompass emotional commitment, requiring action despite separation imposed by duty to serve royal interests through military service that might last months, depending upon enemy resistance and foreign intervention. I understand if military obligations require priorities that place campaign success above personal correspondence, Rosalind concluded with selflessness that characterized her approach to their relationship. Yet your support through written communication provides encouragement that helps overcome isolation when facing challenges alone that we previously confronted together through cooperation and mutual commitment. The letter ended with expressions of love that honored their engagement while respecting professional boundaries that military service required. Yet her emotional honesty revealed depth of attachment that had grown beyond simple romance into genuine partnership, requiring ongoing investment, despite physical separation and competing obligations that tested commitment through distance and time. As evening deepened around the command tent where tactical planning continued for battles that would determine rebellion's fate, Kael acknowledged that his greatest challenge was not military strategy, but maintaining connection with someone whose welfare had become more important than campaign success or political advancement through service to royal interests that might require sacrificing personal relationships for abstract principles. The Alpha of Ravencrest was discovering that love required courage to maintain emotional truth, despite separation and obstacles that tested commitment through circumstances that challenged both individual strength and mutual trust in principles that transcended immediate convenience or strategic advantage, gained through conventional approaches to power and responsibility. Chapter 19. Crisis from Afar. The urgent dispatch arrived at dawn with the thunder of exhausted horses and the grim efficiency of messengers who had ridden through the night to deliver intelligence that would transform Kael's understanding of threats. Protecting Rosalind had become protecting principle itself, the idea that authority existed to shield the vulnerable rather than exploit them, that power carried obligation to serve justice rather than personal advantage, and that some battles were worth fighting regardless of political cost because surrendering them meant surrendering everything that made leadership morally legitimate. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as their investigation moved from evidence gathering into active confrontation with forces that had operated with impunity for years. The stakes extended far beyond one servant's safety to encompass fundamental questions about whether noble privilege could be reformed through lawful means, or whether corruption had become so entrenched that only dramatic action could restore balance between power and responsibility. The Alpha of Ravencrest was prepared for whatever response their challenge would provoke, yet he knew that victory would require more than strategic thinking. It would demand courage to risk everything he had built for principles that transcended personal advancement or political convenience. The war for justice was escalating, and soon it would test whether righteousness could triumph over systematic corruption when backed by determination that refused to accept defeat as an inevitable outcome of challenging established power structures that benefited from maintaining oppression through fear and intimidation. Chapter 20. The Race Against Injustice. The forced march toward Ravencrest Keep stretched both horses and men beyond normal endurance as Kael pushed his escort through terrain that blurred past with desperate urgency, driven by fear that delay might cost Rosalind her life, while enemies exploited his absence to achieve through legal manipulation what they could never accomplish through honest confrontation or legitimate evidence. Each mile brought renewed calculation of time remaining before trial proceedings that could result in execution for charges specifically designed to exploit religious prejudice and social conditioning about appropriate roles for women whose authority challenged traditional expectations regarding noble qualifications and conventional relationships between classes that had governed feudal society for generations. Sir Aldwyn's scouts report unusual activity around Ravencrest, Captain Morris announced during a brief rest stop required to prevent complete exhaustion of mounts that had already been pushed beyond normal limits of safety and endurance. Armed men wearing religious symbols have established checkpoints on main roads approaching the castle, The intelligence confirmed Kael's fears that enemies had coordinated systematic occupation of his territory while using religious authority to legitimize actions that might otherwise be interpreted as military aggression against local sovereignty, requiring immediate response from loyal forces and potential intervention by royal authorities concerned about unauthorized territorial occupation. Composition and numbers? He inquired with strategic thinking that balanced tactical considerations against desperate urgency for someone whose safety depended upon reaching her before judicial proceedings concluded through predetermined verdict that would eliminate inconvenient witness to systematic corruption, while intimidating others who might challenge established privilege through testimony or evidence. Approximately 50 armed men positioned to control access while maintaining the appearance of legitimate religious investigation, rather than military occupation, Morris replied with professional assessment that revealed sophisticated planning designed to achieve objectives through legal manipulation, rather than direct confrontation that might trigger counterattack or political retaliation. The numbers suggested coordinated operation requiring substantial financial resources and political coordination between religious authorities and secular enemies whose shared interest lay in eliminating someone whose effective leadership threatened traditional power structures, while demonstrating that authority could transcend social boundaries when based upon demonstrated competence rather than inherited privilege. Alternative approaches to castle grounds? Kael asked, recognizing that direct assault would provide enemies with justification for claiming armed resistance to legitimate religious investigation, while potentially resulting in Rosalind's immediate execution as means of preventing rescue that might expose fabricated nature of charges and systematic conspiracy. The old smugglers' caves that connect to castle foundations through tunnels used during previous siege warfare, Morris suggested, with understanding of terrain advantages that knowledge of local geography could provide against enemies whose familiarity with Ravencrest territory might be limited to conventional approaches and main transportation routes. The possibility of covert infiltration offered hope that Kael could reach Rosalind before trial concluded, while avoiding direct confrontation that might escalate the situation beyond possibility of resolution through evidence and testimony that exposed systematic conspiracy rather than legitimate religious investigation of supernatural practices threatening community welfare. Coordinate with Marcus for intelligence about current security arrangements and specific location where she's being held, he commanded with recognition that successful rescue would require precise information about enemy dispositions and internal castle layout that might have been modified during occupation by forces whose objectives included preventing exactly the kind of intervention he was planning. As afternoon brought them within striking distance of home territory that had been transformed into hostile ground, requiring careful navigation and strategic planning to avoid detection while gathering intelligence necessary for effective action, Kael reflected on the transformation of circumstances that had begun with simple moral decision and evolved into military operation requiring coordination of multiple elements. The irony wasn't lost on him that protecting someone from false charges of witchcraft required exactly the kind of covert operation that enemies might characterize as supernatural intervention, rather than logical application of tactical advantages and strategic intelligence to achieve justice through means that transcended conventional legal procedures, corrupted by political manipulation. "Your Grace," Morris observed with concern, that reflected military understanding of risks involved in an operation that pitted small forces against established enemy positions while attempting rescue that could trigger immediate retaliation against a primary target. Success requires precise timing and coordination that leaves little margin for error or unexpected complications. Then we ensure precision through careful preparation and absolute commitment to achieving objectives regardless of personal cost, Kael replied with conviction that surprised him with its intensity. Some missions cannot be accomplished through half measures or strategic retreat when circumstances become difficult. The exchange reflected a complete transformation from a calculated leader who balanced competing interests against political consequences into someone whose authority derived from emotional investment in outcomes that mattered more than conventional measures of success or failure, that might be achieved through compromise with systematic forces preferring administrative convenience to individual justice. As evening approached and final preparations commenced for infiltration that would determine whether love could overcome institutional power, when backed by sufficient courage and determination to risk everything for principles that transcended immediate self-interest, Kael understood that his greatest test was not tactical competence, but moral commitment to relationship that had become more precious than reputation or political advancement. The Alpha of Ravencrest was preparing for battle that would test whether individual action could challenge systematic oppression when guided by emotional truth rather than strategic calculation, personal commitment rather than abstract duty to interests that might require sacrificing those who mattered most, for objectives that lost meaning when divorced from human dignity and individual welfare. Chapter 21. Into the Heart of Darkness. The ancient smugglers' tunnels beneath Ravencrest Keep reeked of centuries-old dampness and geological secrets that had provided refuge for countless souls seeking passage beyond official notice during times when survival depended upon avoiding detection by forces that controlled surface routes and conventional access points to territories where safety might be found through knowledge of hidden pathways. Kael moved through narrow passages with practiced stealth that drew upon childhood explorations of castle foundations and military training in covert operations, his mind focused entirely upon reaching Rosalind before enemies could complete judicial proceedings designed to eliminate inconvenient witnesses while maintaining the appearance of legitimate religious investigation rather than systematic character assassination. The infiltration required precise timing and coordination with Marcus, whose intelligence about current security arrangements had revealed that religious investigators had established an interrogation chamber in the castle's lowest dungeon, where isolation and psychological pressure could be applied without interference from loyal household staff, who might witness treatment that violated standards of justice and human dignity. Guards rotate every 2 hours, Marcus had reported during a brief coordination meeting in a village tavern, where loyal retainers maintained surveillance of castle activities while avoiding detection by occupation forces, whose presence had transformed familiar territory into hostile ground, requiring careful navigation and strategic planning. The information provided tactical framework for rescue operation that would require eliminating or bypassing security positions while reaching target location before interrogation sessions that were designed to force confession through systematic torture disguised as religious examination of supernatural practices, threatening community welfare through demonic influence. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through stone corridors as Kael pressed against concealment that generations of builders had incorporated into castle architecture for exactly this kind of emergency access during siege warfare or political crisis, requiring evacuation of essential personnel through routes unknown to enemies who controlled conventional entry points. 2 guards passed overhead with casual conversation that revealed confidence in security arrangements, while discussing timing of upcoming proceedings that would conclude with predetermined verdict regardless of evidence or testimony that might contradict accusations based upon political motivation rather than factual investigation of alleged supernatural practices. "Should be finished by tomorrow evening," one guard mentioned with a tone that suggested inevitability of execution rather than judicial process requiring careful evaluation of evidence and witness testimony. "The investigators have already prepared documentation confirming demonic possession and threat to community safety, requiring immediate purification through fire." The casual reference to execution by burning struck Kael with horror, that transcended tactical concerns to encompass desperate urgency for someone whose suffering was being orchestrated by enemies who had discovered that religious charges provided legal framework for murder, while avoiding direct confrontation with local authority that might trigger military response. Moving deeper into castle foundations through passages that connected dungeons with external cave systems, He could hear distant sounds of interrogation that confirmed his worst fears about treatment designed to break psychological resistance, rather than determine truth about allegations that existed only in the imagination of enemies seeking to destroy relationship-challenging social conventions. The dungeon entrance appeared ahead, illuminated by torchlight that revealed guard positions and security arrangements requiring careful elimination, without raising alarm that might trigger immediate execution of the primary target before rescue could be completed through tactical advantages provided by surprise and superior knowledge of castle architecture. Steel whispered from sheath as Kael prepared for direct action that would determine whether individual courage could overcome institutional power when backed by sufficient determination to risk everything for principles that transcended conventional obligations or strategic considerations that might counsel patience rather than immediate intervention. The first guard fell silently to precise blade work that combined military training with desperate motivation, his body lowered carefully to prevent sound that might alert additional security positions, while compromising stealth essential for reaching target location before discovery, triggered a response that could result in immediate execution. Torchlight revealed stone chamber where systematic torture was being disguised as religious investigation, iron implements designed for causing pain while avoiding immediate death arranged with professional efficiency, that spoke of extensive experience in extracting confessions from victims whose resistance required gradual application of pressure rather than quick resolution. Rosalind hung suspended from chains that stretched her arms above her head, her clothing torn and stained with evidence of systematic brutality, designed to break spirit rather than determine truth about supernatural practices, that existed only in accusations fabricated by enemies seeking to eliminate inconvenient individuals through legal manipulation rather than honest confrontation. Yet her eyes remained defiant despite obvious suffering, reflecting courage that had sustained her through circumstances that would have broken individuals lacking her resilience and determination to maintain innocence despite pressure designed to force admission of guilt regardless of factual basis for charges that violated every principle of justice and legal procedure. "Your Grace," she whispered with a voice that carried relief, transcending physical pain. "They seek confession of supernatural practices that never existed beyond imagination of enemies who prefer murder to allowing change that challenges traditional authority relationships." The summary confirmed his understanding that rescue was arriving barely in time to prevent the conclusion of proceedings, designed to achieve predetermined outcome, regardless of evidence or testimony that might contradict political objectives, motivating systematic persecution disguised as religious investigation of community threats. "Can you move?" he asked, while cutting chains that had suspended her in position designed to maximize physical discomfort while preventing rest that might restore psychological resistance to interrogation techniques combining torture with religious authority to achieve objectives that honest investigation could never support. "With assistance," she replied with determination that demonstrated remarkable resilience despite systematic abuse designed to destroy, will to resist through combination of physical pain and psychological pressure that would have overwhelmed individuals lacking her courage and commitment to principles that transcended immediate self-preservation. As alarm bells began ringing throughout Castle Complex and enemy forces mobilized to prevent escape of primary target, whose testimony could expose systematic conspiracy, Kael understood that rescue was only beginning of challenge that would require reaching safety beyond reach of religious authorities, whose fabricated charges could be enforced throughout territories where their influence extended beyond normal legal jurisdiction. The Alpha of Ravencrest was extracting someone whose survival had become more important than his own safety, while facing enemies who preferred eliminating inconvenient witnesses to allowing justice that might expose criminal behavior and political manipulation that violated fundamental principles governing legitimate authority and proper relationship between power and service to those who depended upon noble protection. Chapter 22. Flight Through Fire. The Corridors of Ravencrest. Keep echoed with shouts of pursuit and the ring of steel as enemies mobilized to prevent escape of the primary target, whose testimony could expose systematic conspiracy disguised as legitimate religious investigation of supernatural threats requiring immediate intervention to protect community welfare from demonic influence that existed only in the imagination of political enemies. Kael supported Rosalind's weight while navigating passages that led toward external escape routes, his mind calculating tactical advantages provided by superior knowledge of castle architecture against numerical superiority of forces, whose determination to prevent rescue was motivated by recognition that her survival meant exposure of criminal behavior and administrative corruption. "The main gates are sealed," Marcus reported, as he emerged from side passage with bloodied sword that testified to combat effectiveness against enemies who had underestimated resistance that loyal retainers would provide when defending principles that transcended personal safety or conventional obligations to external authorities claiming jurisdiction over internal castle affairs. The intelligence confirmed that direct escape through conventional routes had been anticipated and blocked by forces whose planning included contingencies for exactly this kind of rescue attempt, requiring alternative approaches that might provide access to external territory beyond immediate reach of religious investigators and their military support. The old siege tunnels that connect to cave systems extending beyond castle grounds? Kael inquired, while helping Rosalind maintain movement despite obvious pain from systematic torture, designed to extract confessions through physical suffering, rather than legal procedures requiring evidence and testimony that could withstand honest examination of allegations. Still accessible, though enemy forces have discovered some entrance points and positioned guards to prevent utilization for escape purposes, Marcus replied with professional assessment that balanced tactical possibilities against known security arrangements that limited available options while maintaining hope for successful extraction. The pursuit was intensifying as religious investigators coordinated with local forces to establish a perimeter that would prevent escape while maintaining the appearance of legitimate law enforcement, rather than systematic persecution designed to eliminate inconvenient witnesses whose survival threatened political interests and traditional authority relationships. "They're bringing hunting dogs," Morris warned as distant sounds of animal tracking echoed through stone corridors where pursuit was being organized with efficiency that spoke of extensive preparation for exactly this scenario. Scent trails through confined spaces will provide significant advantages for tracking despite architectural complexities. The development required immediate response that would eliminate tracking capabilities while preserving energy and resources necessary for sustained evasion through terrain that offered both concealment and obstacles that could be used against pursuers whose familiarity with local geography might be limited to conventional routes and main transportation corridors. "Lamp oil and torch flame," Kael commanded with strategic thinking that balanced immediate tactical needs against longer-term consequences of actions that might damage castle infrastructure while achieving objectives that transcended conventional concerns about property preservation or administrative convenience. The controlled fire that resulted would mask scent trails while creating confusion and diversion that drew enemy attention toward spectacular destruction, rather than subtle escape routes that provided access to external territory through passages designed for exactly this kind of emergency evacuation during siege warfare or political crisis. Smoke and flame began filling corridors as pursuit was forced to divide attention between tracking escaped prisoners and responding to fire that threatened structural damage requiring immediate attention from personnel who might otherwise be available for systematic search operations designed to prevent escape through alternative routes. "The chapel crypts connect to external cave systems," Marcus observed as they reached an intersection where multiple passages offered different approaches toward freedom that lay beyond immediate reach of enemies, whose jurisdiction was limited to castle grounds and immediate territorial boundaries that defined religious authority versus local sovereignty. The route through sacred ground provided both practical advantage and symbolic significance. Escape through religious architecture would demonstrate that true faith supported justice, rather than systematic persecution of innocent individuals whose only crimes involved challenging traditional power structures through effective leadership and moral courage. Yet reaching external territory would require traversing the final checkpoint where enemy forces had concentrated their strongest defensive positions, recognizing that preventing escape through known exits was essential for maintaining control over situations that had evolved beyond their initial planning and expectations. Sir William's personal guard holds the chapel entrance, Morris reported after reconnaissance that revealed security arrangements designed to prevent access to escape routes, while maintaining the appearance of legitimate religious investigation rather than military occupation of local territory through unauthorized force deployment. The confrontation was becoming inevitable as the tactical situation narrowed to direct engagement with enemies whose determination to prevent rescue was motivated by recognition that failure meant exposure of criminal conspiracy that had operated through abuse of religious authority and systematic corruption of legal procedures designed to serve justice rather than political convenience. "Then we go through them," Kael declared with conviction that surprised him with its intensity. Some objectives cannot be achieved through indirect approaches or strategic compromise when circumstances require direct action, regardless of personal cost or conventional considerations about appropriate responses to institutional authority. The decision represented a complete transformation from a calculated leader who balanced competing interests against political consequences into someone whose authority derived from emotional investment in outcomes that mattered more than reputation or advancement that might be achieved through compromise with systematic forces preferring administrative convenience to individual dignity. As final preparations commenced for assault that would determine whether love could overcome institutional power when backed by sufficient courage and determination to risk everything for principles that transcended immediate self-interest, Kael understood that his greatest battle was not tactical competence, but moral commitment to relationship that had become more precious than conventional measures of success. The Alpha of Ravencrest was leading the charge against enemies who represented everything he had learned to despise about authority without accountability, power without responsibility, and traditional privilege that exploited rather than protected those who depended upon noble integrity for their safety and welfare, in a world where individual dignity mattered more than institutional convenience. Chapter 23. The Final Stand. The chapel doors exploded inward under coordinated assault as Kael led his small force against entrenched positions that represented more than tactical obstacle. They embodied systematic oppression that preferred destroying innocent individuals to allowing change that challenged traditional authority relationships and conventional expectations about proper social boundaries. Sir William's personal guard had prepared defensive positions with professional competence that reflected military training, yet their commitment to protecting corruption through violence paled beside desperate determination of those whose fight served principles that transcended personal advancement or strategic convenience that might counsel compromise with systematic exploitation. Steel rang against steel in the chamber, where generations of Ravencrest lords had worshipped, the sacred space transformed into a battlefield where justice confronted privilege, while truth challenged systematic deception that had operated through abuse of religious authority and manipulation of legal procedures designed to serve political objectives rather than individual dignity. "Surrender the witch and face no charges for interference with legitimate religious investigation," Sir William called from behind the altar that had been converted into a defensive position, his voice carrying authority that assumed continued effectiveness of intimidation through official titles and institutional backing. "The only crime here is your systematic persecution of innocent individuals whose effective leadership threatened corrupt practices that you prefer to maintain through violence and legal manipulation," Kael replied, with conviction that had been forged through months of learning what authority meant when exercised in service of those who mattered most. The exchange reflected fundamental conflict between competing visions of legitimate governance, one based upon traditional privilege and institutional power, the other grounded in personal commitment to protecting vulnerable individuals from systematic exploitation, regardless of political consequences or social disapproval that might result from unconventional choices. Battle resumed with renewed intensity, as enemies recognized that negotiation was impossible with someone whose priorities had been transformed through emotional investment in outcomes that could not be achieved through strategic compromise or administrative convenience that treated people as abstract resources rather than individuals deserving personal consideration and protection. Kael's sword work demonstrated training that had never been abandoned, despite years devoted primarily to administrative duties, muscle memory guiding strikes that found gaps in armor while his determination provided energy that transcended normal physical limitations when fighting for something more precious than political advancement or conventional measures of success. The passage behind the altar leads to external cave systems, Marcus called, while engaging multiple opponents whose coordination was beginning to break down under pressure from attackers whose motivation exceeded professional duty to encompass moral commitment that inspired extraordinary effort and tactical innovation. The intelligence provided hope that escape remained possible, despite enemy attempts to prevent access to routes that would carry them beyond immediate reach of religious authorities, whose fabricated charges could be enforced only within limited territorial jurisdiction that ended at boundaries between legitimate local sovereignty and unauthorized occupation. Yet reaching external passage required eliminating remaining resistance from forces whose desperation was increasing, as recognition grew that failure meant exposure of criminal conspiracy that had operated through systematic abuse of authority and coordination between religious and secular enemies whose shared interests lay in maintaining corrupt practices. Sir William himself emerged from a defensive position with a sword that gleamed with reflected candlelight from the altar that had witnessed centuries of worship, his expression revealing someone whose entire worldview was threatened by possibility that traditional authority relationships might be challenged through individual courage and moral commitment that transcended conventional obligations. You risk everything for a servant girl whose elevation above proper station demonstrates a dangerous departure from natural order that maintains social stability, he declared. With conviction that reflected genuine belief in principles that justified systematic oppression through traditional privilege and institutional power that served narrow interests rather than common welfare. I risk everything for someone whose courage and integrity demonstrate that true nobility derives from character rather than inherited position, Kael countered while their blades met in combination that would determine whether love could overcome systematic corruption when backed by sufficient determination to challenge forces that preferred convenience to justice. The personal combat represented symbolic conflict between competing visions of legitimate authority, while tactical battle continued around them as loyal retainers fought against enemies whose numerical advantages were being neutralized through superior motivation and strategic advantages provided by knowledge of local terrain and architectural features. Steel sparked against steel as opponents tested each other's skill and determination, yet underlying struggle transcended simple martial contests to encompass fundamental questions about proper relationship between power and responsibility that defined civilized governance versus systematic exploitation of vulnerable populations. Sir William's technique demonstrated professional competence, yet his commitment to protecting corruption lacked the emotional foundation that provided Kael with advantages beyond simple tactical training or strategic positioning, the knowledge that victory served principles more important than personal survival or conventional advancement. The decisive moment came when enemy resistance collapsed under combined pressure from multiple directions, their coordination breaking down as leadership was eliminated, and remaining forces recognized that continued fighting served no purpose beyond prolonging inevitable defeat that had been determined by superior motivation, rather than tactical advantages. The way is clear, Marcus reported, as final opposition was overcome through coordination between tactical competence and moral commitment that had inspired extraordinary effort from individuals whose loyalty transcended professional obligation to encompass personal investment in outcomes affecting those who mattered most. As escape route opened toward external territory that lay beyond immediate reach of enemies whose authority was limited to specific jurisdictions and conventional legal procedures, Kael understood that victory had been achieved through transformation of his understanding about what made authority legitimate and power worthwhile. The Alpha of Ravencrest had learned that protecting individual dignity could inspire systematic change when backed by courage and supported by allies whose shared commitment to principles transcended immediate self-interest or political convenience, that might counsel compromise with forces preferring exploitation to service in eternal struggle between justice and systematic oppression. Chapter 24. Dawn of New Understanding. The dawnlight filtering through ancient oak trees cast golden patterns across the forest, clearing where Kael and Rosalind had found temporary refuge after escaping the systematic persecution that had threatened to destroy not only her life but everything he had come to understand about the proper relationship between authority and those who depended upon noble protection from forces that preferred exploitation to service. 3 days of careful travel through woodland paths had carried them beyond immediate reach of religious investigators whose fabricated charges could no longer be enforced through territorial jurisdiction that ended at boundaries between legitimate local sovereignty and external authority, that required formal legal procedures rather than administrative manipulation designed to achieve predetermined outcomes. The royal courier arrives this morning, Marcus reported as he returned from reconnaissance that had established contact with loyal forces who had been coordinating political response to systematic conspiracy that had operated through abuse of religious authority and corruption of legal procedures designed to serve justice, rather than personal advancement or factional interests. The intelligence provided hope that resolution might be achieved through official channels that would expose criminal behavior, while restoring legitimate governance to territory that had been occupied by enemies, whose objectives included eliminating inconvenient witnesses to systematic corruption and administrative manipulation that violated fundamental principles governing civilized society. Lord Fairfax has documented evidence of conspiracy between Sir William and corrupt religious authorities. Marcus continued with satisfaction, that reflected successful coordination between multiple allies whose commitment to principle had overcome political pressure and institutional resistance to investigation of systematic abuse, disguised as legitimate law enforcement. The revelation confirmed that their struggle had inspired broader recognition of problems that extended beyond individual persecution to encompass systematic threats to justice and legal integrity that required comprehensive reform, rather than simple resolution of immediate crisis affecting particular people whose welfare had become central to understanding what made authority legitimate. "The charges against you have been formally dismissed," Kael informed Rosalind with relief that transcended political satisfaction to encompass personal gratitude, that someone whose courage had inspired transformation of his priorities would not face continued persecution for crimes that existed only in imagination of enemies seeking to eliminate inconvenient testimony. More importantly, he continued with recognition that their experience had revealed truths about governance and responsibility that transcended immediate circumstances. The investigation has exposed systematic corruption that will result in comprehensive reform of oversight mechanisms designed to prevent future abuse of religious authority for political objectives. The broader implications provided context for suffering they had endured while demonstrating that individual courage could inspire institutional change when supported by allies whose shared commitment to principles transcended immediate self-interest or conventional obligations that might counsel compromise with systematic exploitation. "What happens now?" Rosalind asked with expression that combined relief at immediate safety with uncertainty about future possibilities that had been opened through legal victory over forces that had seemed insurmountable when backed by religious authority and political coordination between enemies whose influence extended throughout administrative systems. "Now we rebuild," Kael replied, with confidence that reflected a transformed understanding of leadership as service rather than simple exercise of inherited privilege or strategic positioning within hierarchies that might prioritize administrative convenience over individual dignity and community welfare that required personal attention rather than institutional management. The castle requires restoration from damage caused by occupation forces whose presence violated territorial sovereignty while serving objectives that had nothing to do with legitimate religious investigation or community safety. He continued with recognition that physical reconstruction would parallel political and social healing necessary for restoring trust and stability. Yet personal satisfaction came not from restoration of conventional authority, but from knowledge that their relationship had survived testing that might have destroyed partnerships based upon strategic convenience, rather than genuine commitment to shared principles and mutual respect that honored individuals' worth above social positioning or traditional expectations. Our engagement remains valid despite attempts to destroy it through systematic persecution, he declared with conviction that surprised him with its intensity. If you still wish to proceed with marriage, that will challenge social conventions while honoring truth that has emerged through circumstances testing both courage and commitment to principles that transcend immediate convenience. I wish nothing more than to formalize a relationship that has already transcended conventional boundaries through shared experience and mutual commitment to protecting those who depend upon integrity rather than exploitation, Rosalind replied with a smile that illuminated features that had been marked by suffering yet retained beauty that reflected inner strength and moral courage. The affirmation represented more than simple personal happiness. It constituted recognition that authority derived legitimacy from emotional investment in those whose welfare required protection, rather than abstract service to administrative efficiency or political advancement that might be achieved through compromise with systematic corruption. As afternoon brought formal restoration of local authority and legal resolution of charges that had threatened to destroy relationship, that challenged traditional expectations while demonstrating effectiveness of leadership based upon character rather than inherited privilege, Kael understood that his greatest victory had been transformation of his understanding about what made power worthwhile. The Alpha of Ravencrest had learned that protecting individual dignity could reshape institutional relationships when guided by moral commitment rather than strategic calculation, personal truth rather than political convenience, and emotional honesty rather than professional distance that treated people as abstract resources requiring efficient management. The castle requires restoration from damage caused by occupation forces, whose presence violated territorial sovereignty while serving objectives that had nothing to do with legitimate religious investigation or community safety. He continued, with recognition that physical reconstruction would parallel political and social healing necessary for restoring trust and stability. Yet personal satisfaction came not from restoration of conventional authority, but from knowledge that their relationship had survived testing that might have destroyed partnerships based upon strategic convenience, rather than genuine commitment to shared principles and mutual respect that honored individuals' worth above social positioning or traditional expectations. Our engagement remains valid despite attempts to destroy it through systematic persecution, he declared with conviction that surprised him with its intensity. If you still wish to proceed with marriage, that will challenge social conventions while honoring truth that has emerged through circumstances testing both courage and commitment to principles that transcend immediate convenience. I wish nothing more than to formalize a relationship that has already transcended conventional boundaries through shared experience and mutual commitment to protecting those who depend upon integrity rather than exploitation, Rosalind replied with a smile that illuminated features that had been marked by suffering yet retained beauty that reflected inner strength and moral courage. The affirmation represented more than simple personal happiness. It constituted recognition that authority derived legitimacy from emotional investment in those whose welfare required protection rather than abstract service to administrative efficiency or political advancement that might be achieved through compromise with systematic corruption. As afternoon brought formal restoration of local authority and legal resolution of charges that had threatened to destroy relationship, that challenged traditional expectations while demonstrating effectiveness of leadership based upon character rather than inherited privilege, Kael understood that his greatest victory had been transformation of his understanding about what made power worthwhile. The Alpha of Ravencrest had learned that protecting individual dignity could reshape institutional relationships when guided by moral commitment rather than strategic calculation, personal truth rather than political convenience, and emotional honesty rather than professional distance that treated people as abstract resources requiring efficient management. Their story would continue through marriage that honored both social responsibility and personal attachment while serving principles that transcended conventional boundaries between classes. Yet this chapter had reached natural conclusion with recognition that some relationships were worth risking everything to protect because they embodied values that defined difference between civilization and systematic oppression. The silent terror that had characterized Rosalind's initial circumstances had been transformed into confident partnership that would serve community welfare while demonstrating that effective governance required emotional investment in outcomes affecting specific individuals, rather than simple adherence to formal obligations that could be fulfilled through institutional mechanisms rather than personal commitment to those whose welfare had become essential to leaders' own sense of moral legitimacy and purpose. Chapter 25. Epilogue. The Wedding Dawn. 6 months after the defeat of systematic persecution that had threatened to destroy both individual lives and institutional integrity, Ravencrest Keep buzzed with preparation for celebration that would formally unite two people whose relationship had already transcended conventional boundaries, through shared commitment to principles that honored personal dignity above social expectations or political convenience. The Great Hall had been transformed from a site of political confrontation into a magnificent setting for ceremony that would demonstrate how genuine partnership could emerge from circumstances that tested courage and determination, while inspiring broader recognition of what made authority legitimate through service rather than exploitation of those who depended upon noble protection. Kael stood before ancestral portraits that had witnessed centuries of Ravencrest leadership, his reflection in polished armor revealing someone whose understanding of power and responsibility had been fundamentally transformed through learning that effective governance required emotional investment in outcomes affecting specific individuals, rather than abstract administrative efficiency. Your Grace appears remarkably calm for someone whose unconventional choice continues to generate discussion throughout court circles, Marcus observed with satisfaction that reflected pride in a lord whose integrity had overcome political pressure while achieving justice that many had thought impossible against systematic corruption and institutional resistance. Calm comes from certainty that some decisions transcend political calculation to serve principles that matter more than social approval or strategic advancement, Kael replied, with conviction that had been forged through circumstances testing every assumption about maintaining professional distance from personal attachments that might compromise objective judgment. The guest list included nobles whose presence demonstrated respect for courage that had exposed systematic corruption, while allies whose support had been essential for achieving legal victory that protected innocent individuals from religious persecution disguised as legitimate investigation of community threats requiring immediate intervention. Lord Fairfax occupied a position of honor that reflected royal recognition of Kael's service in exposing conspiracy that had threatened institutional integrity, while demonstrating effectiveness of principled leadership that served justice above personal advancement or factional interests that might counsel compromise with forces preferring exploitation to service. The King sends formal congratulations along with appointment as Special Counselor for Administrative Reform, Fairfax announced with expression that suggested genuine satisfaction at recognition of capabilities that had been proven through methodical investigation and strategic coordination, with allies committed to exposing systematic abuse of authority. The royal acknowledgement represented validation of unconventional choices, while providing a framework for expanded service that honored both personal relationships and public responsibilities, requiring balance between individual welfare and broader interests that transcended immediate circumstances affecting particular people whose protection had become central to understanding legitimate governance. Yet personal satisfaction came not from political advancement, but from knowledge that marriage would formalize partnership that had already demonstrated capacity for serving community welfare, while challenging traditional assumptions about appropriate qualifications for leadership positions, requiring wisdom and integrity rather than simply inherited privilege or strategic alliance. Rosalind entered the hall with grace that reflected transformation from terrified victim into confident woman, whose courage had inspired systematic reform while demonstrating that individual actions could reshape institutional relationships when guided by moral commitment rather than strategic calculation or administrative convenience that treated people as abstract resources. Her wedding gown had been crafted by castle seamstresses, whose enthusiasm for the project reflected genuine affection earned through months of effective household management that had protected vulnerable populations, while maintaining stability during extended absence required by military obligations and political crisis. "She appears radiant," observed Brother Thomas, the monastery representative whose presence provided religious blessing for union that challenged social conventions, while honoring principles that transcended species boundaries or political jurisdictions, to embrace universal concepts of justice and human dignity. The ceremony proceeded with dignity that reflected the importance of commitments being made, while acknowledging realistic understanding that marriage represented beginning, rather than conclusion of partnership that would require ongoing dedication to shared values and mutual support, through challenges that would inevitably test resolve and commitment. "Do you, Kael Ravencrest, take this woman as partner in all endeavors, protector of her welfare and guardian of principles that honor individual dignity above personal advancement or strategic convenience?" Brother Thomas inquired with solemnity that reflected recognition of vows that transcended conventional marriage promises to encompass moral obligations, requiring sacrifice of immediate self-interest for broader purposes. "I do," Kael replied with certainty that surprised him with its emotional force, recognizing that commitment represented complete transformation from an isolated ruler maintaining professional distance into a leader whose authority derived from personal investment in those whose welfare had become more important than political achievement or conventional measures of success. "Do you, Rosalind, accept partnership with someone whose protection and commitment honor your dignity, while serving principles that transcend social boundaries or traditional expectations about appropriate relationships between authority and those who depend upon integrity rather than exploitation?" The monk continued with understanding of unconventional circumstances. "I do," she replied with a voice that carried clearly throughout the chamber where assembled nobles witnessed accountability and commitment that challenged assumptions about power relationships, while demonstrating effectiveness of leadership based upon character rather than inherited position or strategic alliance serving narrow factional interests. The exchange of rings symbolized mutual commitment that had already been tested through circumstances requiring extraordinary courage, while formal recognition provided social framework for relationship that would serve community welfare through partnership that honored both individual dignity and collective responsibility for protecting vulnerable populations. The letter from the royal court arrived on a morning when autumn mist clung to Ravencrest Keep's towers, like memories of summer warmth reluctant to surrender to winter's approach. Kael broke the royal seal with movements that had become automatic through years of correspondence, yet the contents struck him with unexpected force that challenged everything he believed about duty, honor, and the price of political advancement. His Majesty formally requested Alpha Kael Ravencrest's service as Chief Royal Investigator, a position carrying authority to root out corruption throughout the realm, while commanding resources that would make him one of the most powerful lords in the kingdom. The appointment represented the culmination of political achievement that any ambitious nobleman would pursue through decades of careful maneuvering and strategic alliance building. Yet reading the ornate script that detailed responsibilities requiring permanent residence at court, Kael felt something approaching dread rather than satisfaction. Accepting this honor would mean leaving Ravencrest for extended periods, abandoning direct oversight of those who depended upon his protection while pursuing abstract justice that served royal interests rather than local welfare requiring personal attention and emotional investment. "Momentous news, Your Grace?" Marcus inquired from his position beside the desk, where administrative duties continued despite political developments that would reshape Kael's understanding of his obligations and priorities in ways that challenged fundamental assumptions about leadership and service. "The king offers appointment as chief royal investigator," Kael replied, with a tone that revealed internal conflict rather than pleasure at recognition of his capabilities and achievements in exposing systematic corruption through methodical investigation and strategic coordination with allies committed to justice above personal advancement. Marcus's weathered features brightened with satisfaction that reflected his understanding of political significance represented by such appointments, validation of local authority, and demonstration of royal confidence in Kael's integrity and effectiveness that would enhance their domain's influence throughout the realm, while opening possibilities for expanded resources and strategic advantages. "Remarkable honor, Your Grace," Marcus observed with genuine pride in his lord's achievement. "Chief Royal Investigator commands authority second only to the Crown itself in matters of administrative integrity and criminal prosecution. Your influence would extend throughout the kingdom." The enthusiasm in his captain's voice reminded Kael that others viewed this opportunity through conventional perspectives on political advancement and strategic positioning that had guided his own decisions for 15 years of calculated leadership, focused on maintaining stability and prosperity through careful balance of competing interests and obligations. Yet something had changed during recent months. His understanding of authority had evolved from abstract administrative responsibility into personal commitment to individuals whose welfare had become more important than political achievement or strategic advantage that might be gained through advancement to positions of greater influence and expanded power. "The position requires permanent residence at court," he mentioned quietly, testing his own emotional response to speaking aloud, the reality that accepting this honor would mean abandoning direct involvement in lives that had begun to matter more than administrative efficiency or political reputation. Marcus paused in his enthusiastic assessment as implications became clear. Extended absence from Ravencrest would create challenges for local administration, he acknowledged, with growing understanding of conflict between personal advancement and feudal obligations that required presence and attention, rather than distant oversight through appointed representatives. "More than administrative challenges," Kael admitted with recognition that surprised him. "There are individuals here whose welfare depends upon personal protection, rather than institutional safeguards that might be corrupted or overwhelmed by forces beyond normal oversight mechanisms." The comment revealed how profoundly his priorities had shifted during investigation, that began with simple observation of abuse and evolved into fundamental questioning of emotional distance that had characterized his approach to leadership since inheriting local authority at 17 years of age when plague claimed his father. "Rosalind," Marcus stated with understanding that reflected his observation of changes in his lord's behavior and decision-making processes that had moved beyond strategic calculation to encompass emotional investment in outcomes affecting specific individuals, rather than abstract populations requiring efficient management. The name spoken aloud struck Kael with force that confirmed his growing recognition that accepting royal appointment would mean abandoning someone whose safety and happiness had become essential to his own sense of purpose and moral legitimacy as leader whose authority existed to protect, rather than exploit those who depended upon noble integrity. "Among others," he replied carefully, unwilling to reveal the full extent of personal attachment that had developed despite his lifetime of training in maintaining professional distance from emotional complications that might compromise objective judgment in situations requiring strategic rather than sentimental responses. Yet denial felt hollow when measured against evidence of his own behavior during recent months, the way his attention sought her presence during daily routines, the satisfaction he felt when her confidence grew through security of protection, the fierce anger that arose when anyone threatened her welfare or questioned his commitment to safeguarding those under his care. A soft knock interrupted their discussion, as morning duties brought a familiar presence that had become central to Kael's understanding of why authority existed, and how it should be exercised in service of those who trusted noble protection to shield them from systematic exploitation and abuse by forces that valued power over principle. "Your morning wine, Your Grace," Rosalind announced with a voice that carried confidence earned through surviving circumstances that had tested resilience and courage beyond normal expectations, while inspiring transformation in someone whose emotional distance had been carefully cultivated through years of strategic thinking and calculated decision-making. She entered with grace that reflected growth from terrified victim into a secure woman whose presence reminded him daily that individual actions could reshape institutional relationships when guided by moral commitment rather than simple political calculation or administrative convenience that might counsel compromise with systematic corruption. "Rosalind," he said with warmth that surprised him with its intensity, "please remain. There are developments that may affect your circumstances." Her expression revealed immediate concern mixed with trust that he would act in her best interests regardless of political pressures or strategic considerations that might counsel different approaches to balancing competing obligations and responsibilities, requiring careful navigation between personal attachment and local duty. "The king has offered me appointment as chief royal investigator," he explained with a tone that invited her response, rather than simply informing her of decisions made without consultation. "It would require permanent residence at court while investigating corruption throughout the realm." Understanding dawned in her brown eyes as implications became clear. His advancement would mean separation from those who had come to depend upon his personal protection, rather than institutional safeguards that might prove inadequate when tested by determined enemies or systematic corruption of oversight mechanisms. "That's wonderful, Your Grace," she replied with a voice that carried genuine happiness for his achievement despite the personal cost that such an appointment would represent for her own security and future welfare. "You've earned recognition for courage and integrity that exposed systematic corruption while protecting innocent people." The selfless response struck him with emotional force that confirmed his growing understanding that some relationships transcended formal boundaries between lord and subject to encompass genuine partnership in serving principles that mattered more than political advancement or strategic positioning within royal administration. The choice was becoming clear. Yet it challenged everything he had been taught about duty, ambition, and the proper relationship between personal desires and obligations to serve broader interests that transcended individual attachment or emotional investment in specific outcomes affecting particular people, rather than abstract populations.